Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It was around 11 p.m. on a particularly cold January night. The temperature had dropped to about 25 degrees Fahrenheit, and I was loading the last batch of firewood into my 2015 Ford F-150. I've always been kind of particular about keeping my woodpile stocked. My dad taught me to never let it get below half full during winter. The night was dead quiet, except for the sound of wood thunking against the truck bed and the occasional crunch of frozen leaves under my boots. I remember checking my phone at some point. It was 11:13 p.m. I only remember because I was thinking about heading in soon to catch the weather forecast at 11:30. The moon was nearly full that night, casting weird shadows through the bare trees. About 50 feet behind my house, there's this marshy area that never really dries up, full of these deep holes and thick undergrowth. Even during the day, I avoid walking through there because it's so treacherous. That's when I heard it. This strange tinkling sound, like someone was gently shaking a jar of glass marbles. It came from the direction of the marsh, maybe 100 yards into the woods. At first I thought maybe it was ice breaking off tree branches, but it had this deliberate quality to it. Without thinking, I said out loud, "What the hell was that?" What happened next still makes my skin crawl. The forest just died. I mean, there's always some kind of noise in the woods. Crickets, frogs, the rustle of leaves. But for 15 seconds, it was like someone had hit a mute button on the whole world. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. Then the footsteps started. I've been a hunter all my life. I know what deer sound like moving through the woods. I know what bears sound like. Hell, I even know what moose sound like from hunting trips up north. This was different. The steps were heavy, not just heavy but deliberate, two-legged. The rhythm was all wrong for any four-legged animal. Each step sounded like someone dropping a bowling ball onto fallen branches. But they were moving fast, way too fast for how heavy they seemed. Whatever it was moving through that marshy area like it wasn't even there. I'm talking about an area where I've seen grown men sink up to their thighs in mud holes during broad daylight. But this thing was just powering through it at what had to be a running pace. The stride length must have been enormous. The footfalls were too far apart to be human. I could track its movement by sound. It was heading northeast through the marsh, away from my property. The crashes through the undergrowth were punctuated by these weird snapping sounds, like baseball bats being broken in half. Those weren't small branches being stepped on. These were solid limbs being pushed aside like twigs. There was this smell too. It hit me about 30 seconds after the footsteps started. Everyone talks about Bigfoot smell being like rotting garbage or wet dog. But this was different. It was sharp and musky, like wet leather left in the sun, mixed with something metallic. It wasn't overwhelming, just this subtle wrongness in the air that made my nose burn slightly. I stood there completely frozen, still holding a piece of firewood. My arms were starting to shake, but not from the cold. I couldn't move. It wasn't just fear, though believe me, I was terrified. It was like some primitive part of my brain had taken over and decided that absolute stillness was the only acceptable response. The footsteps continued for maybe 2 minutes, getting progressively fainter as whatever it was moved deeper into the forest. But here's the detail that really gets me. Throughout its entire retreat, this thing never once broke its stride or seemed to slow down. Through marsh, through thorns, through whatever was in its path, it maintained the same rapid, powerful pace. When I could no longer hear the footsteps, the normal forest sounds didn't come back right away. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. Gradually, over the next few minutes, I started hearing individual crickets, then more, until the regular nighttime chorus slowly rebuilt itself. My security lights never went off during the whole incident. I have them mounted on my house and garage, covering the backyard up to about 40 feet into the woods. Whatever this was, it was smart enough to stay just beyond that perimeter of light. I finally managed to move about 5 minutes after the last sound faded. My first instinct was to run inside, but instead I forced myself to finish loading the wood into my truck. Looking back, I think I was operating on autopilot, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped 2 pieces before I got them in the bed. Once inside, I spent hours looking out my back windows, but nothing else happened that night. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I went out to check the marsh area. The ground was too frozen to show prints, but I found 3 trees with branches broken off about 8 feet up. These weren't dead branches either. They were healthy limbs too, 3 inches thick, snapped clean off. The breaks were fresh, the wood still light-colored and raw. I found something else too, something I still can't explain. In one of the muddier spots that hadn't completely frozen, there was this weird pattern pressed into the ground. Not a footprint exactly, but this oval-shaped depression about 17 inches long. The edges were clean, like whatever made it had lifted straight up out of the mud instead of sliding or stepping forward. I've never heard that glass tinkling sound again, though I've spent countless nights since then straining my ears, wondering if it would return. I've walked that property hundreds of times in the daylight since then, looking for more evidence, but never found anything conclusive. I installed more security cameras after that night, but they've never caught anything unusual. Sometimes, on really quiet nights, I'll be out in my yard and the forest sounds will suddenly stop. That absolute silence will settle in, and I'll find myself holding my breath, waiting. But whatever visited that January night has never returned, at least not where I could hear or see it. I've told this story to exactly 3 people before writing it here. 2 of them politely suggested it was probably a bear, despite the fact that the last confirmed black bear sighting in this part of South Carolina was over a decade ago. The 3rd person, an old-timer who's lived in these parts his whole life, just nodded and told me I was lucky it was just passing through. I still cut and stack firewood at night sometimes, but never after 9 p.m. anymore. And I always make sure my truck is parked facing the house, ready to leave. Some lessons you only need to learn once. Story 2. It all started on October 12, 2020. I remember the date clearly because it was right after my birthday, and I'd just finished installing some new security lights around my property. I live on about 12 acres, with dense woods surrounding 3 sides of my land. My house sits about 200 feet back from the road, and I've got a decent-sized workshop where I do woodworking about 100 feet behind the house. That night, around 11:30 p.m., I was in my living room watching TV when I heard it. At first I thought it was someone yelling, but it wasn't like any human voice I'd ever heard. It was this incredibly loud, drawn-out whoop sound that seemed to echo through the entire property. The sound was so powerful it made my dogs, I have 2 German shepherds, freeze completely. They just stood there, ears perked up, staring out the window toward the eastern tree line. The whoops were unlike anything I'd ever heard in these woods, and I've lived here for 8 years. They weren't coyotes or owls. I know those sounds well. This was different. The sound had this deep, almost resonant quality, like someone blowing across a huge bottle, but impossibly loud. What really got to me was how it seemed to silence everything else. Usually, at night, you can hear all sorts of creatures. Crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. But when these whoops started, everything else went dead quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and went out onto my back deck. The security lights were on, illuminating the immediate area around the house, but beyond that, it was pitch black. The October air was crisp, probably around 55 degrees, and there was just a slight breeze rustling the trees. As I stood there, another whoop came from the direction of the eastern woods, maybe 300 yards away. It was so loud that I could feel it in my chest. My dogs were right beside me, and they were acting strange, not barking or growling, just standing rigid, their fur slightly raised. Over the next few hours, I heard the whoops periodically, always from different locations around the property. Sometimes they seemed to come from the eastern woods, then they'd answer from the north, like whatever was making them was moving around the perimeter of my land. I stayed up until about 3 a.m., documenting the sounds on my phone, though the recordings don't do justice to how powerful they were in person. This continued for several nights, always starting around the same time. I installed more security cameras, thinking maybe I could catch whatever was making these sounds on video, but the whoops always came from just beyond where my cameras could see, just beyond where my security lights reached. Then, about 2 weeks later, things escalated. I started hearing wood knocks. Now, I know what normal wood sounds are like. Branches falling, trees creaking in the wind. These were different. They had this deliberate quality to them, almost like someone using a baseball bat to hit a tree, but with a weird metallic resonance I can't really explain. The first time I heard them was on October 28th, around midnight. I was in my workshop, finishing up a project. I sometimes work late when I can't sleep, which had been happening more often since the whoops started. I heard 3 distinct knocks from the eastern tree line, followed by a pause, then 2 knocks from the northern section of the woods, then 3 more from the east. It was like some kind of call and response pattern. The knocks followed a clear sequence. 3 knocks, pause, 2 knocks, pause, 3 knocks. This wasn't random. It was deliberate communication. I've worked with wood all my life, and I know the difference between natural sounds and something intentional. These knocks had a rhythm, a purpose. What really disturbed me was how these knocking sessions would play out. They'd start with that same pattern, 3-2-3, and then evolve into more complex sequences. Sometimes they'd go on for hours, with different locations in the woods responding to each other. The sound wasn't quite like wood on wood. It had this strange, almost metallic quality that I've never been able to explain. It was like the sound was resonating through the trees in a way that shouldn't be possible. One night, probably around November 5th, I decided to try something. When I heard the usual 3 knocks from the east, I grabbed a piece of hardwood from my workshop and knocked back. 3 times. The woods went completely silent for what felt like minutes. Then, from much closer than ever before, maybe just 100 feet into the tree line, came 5 rapid knocks that were so loud they seemed to shake the air. I immediately regretted responding. The atmosphere changed. It felt heavier, more threatening. My security lights started triggering one after another, like something was moving just at their edges, but I couldn't see anything. My dogs, who were usually right by my side, retreated to the house, whining. That's when I noticed the smell. It was like nothing I'd encountered before, a mix of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something musky and wild. The odor was so strong it made my eyes water. It seemed to come in waves, stronger when the wind blew from the east. I heard movement in the underbrush, not like a deer or coyote, but heavy, deliberate steps. Branches cracked under significant weight. Whatever was moving out there was big, and it wasn't trying to be quiet anymore. I could hear the brush being pushed aside, small trees creaking as something moved past them. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of my security light's reach, where the woods begin, something moved. At first I thought it was just shadows from the trees, but then I realized the shadow was moving against the wind. It was huge. I'm 6'2", and this thing was at least 8 feet tall. Its outline was broad, distinctly humanoid but massive. What hit me most was how it moved, smooth, controlled, nothing like a bear or any other animal I know. I stood there completely frozen, as this figure stayed just at the edge of the light. It was like it wanted me to see it, but not clearly. The wood knocks started again, but this time they were coming from behind me as well, from the other side of my property. Whatever I was looking at wasn't alone. That's when my fight or flight kicked in. I backed away slowly toward my house, never turning my back to the woods. As I reached my back door, I heard this deep, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't like any animal I'd ever heard. It was almost subsonic, more felt than heard. I got inside, locked everything down, and stayed up all night, watching through the windows. The knocking continued until dawn, moving around my property in patterns I couldn't understand. When the sun came up, I went out to investigate. What I found still gives me chills. Around the edge of my property, I found several trees with bark stripped off at about 8 feet high. There were branches broken off well above where any normal person could reach, and they weren't old breaks. These were fresh, with sap still oozing. But what really got to me were the footprints. They were hard to make out in the leaf litter, but in a few muddy spots near the tree line, I found them. Each print was at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep. Whatever made them had to be incredibly heavy. The activity continued for about another week, gradually becoming less frequent, until it stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The last night I heard anything was November 15th, just a single, powerful whoop from deep in the woods, and then nothing. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what happened during those weeks. I've researched every animal native to South Carolina, Every possible explanation for the sounds and movements I witnessed. Nothing fits. The coordinated knocking, the deliberate patterns of movement, the size of what I saw. It all points to something I can't explain. I've upgraded my security system since then, installed more cameras and lights. I've got motion sensors covering every approach to my house. But sometimes, especially on quiet nights, I still find myself listening for those whoops and knocks, wondering if whatever visited my property in those strange weeks of 2020 will ever return. The weirdest part? About a month after everything stopped, I ran into one of my neighbors at the local hardware store. Without me mentioning anything, he asked if I'd heard any strange noises coming from the woods lately. He'd been hearing weird calls and knocking sounds too, but was too embarrassed to bring it up. Turns out several people in the area had similar experiences that fall, but no one wanted to be the first to talk about it. I still live in the same house, still work in my workshop, but I don't stay out there late anymore. Some nights, when the wind is right, I catch a whiff of that strange, musky odor, and my dogs get that same alert look they had back then. Whatever was out there, whatever was trying to communicate, I'm convinced it's still in these woods, watching, waiting. I just hope I never give it a reason to come closer again. Story 3. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened that night in October 2020 still haunts me. My wife Sarah and I live on the outskirts of Duncan, South Carolina, in a house that backs up to about 80 acres of dense woodland. We've always loved our location, peaceful, private, with a wraparound porch where we often sit in the evenings after dinner. That night changed everything about how we view our piece of paradise. It was around 10:30 p.m. on October 12th, unusually warm for that time of year. We were sitting on our back porch like we usually do, enjoying some decaf coffee and watching the fireflies. The moon was nearly full, casting enough light to see pretty far into the tree line. Our motion sensor lights weren't on, which meant nothing big had wandered into our yard. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet it had gotten. Usually you can hear crickets, owls, and all sorts of night creatures, but everything just stopped. Sarah noticed it too. She squeezed my hand and whispered, "Travis, why is it so quiet?" That's when I got that feeling. You know the one, like you're being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt this heavy pressure in my chest. I scanned the tree line, more out of instinct than anything else. That's when I saw them. Two eyes reflecting in the moonlight, about 150 yards into the woods. At first I thought it might be a deer, but something was off. These eyes were way too far apart. I'd say at least 8-10 inches between them. They were also higher off the ground than any deer I'd ever seen, probably 7 or 8 feet up. The reflection was unlike anything I'd seen before, not the typical blue-green you get from deer or coyotes, but more of a deep reddish amber. My first instinct was to grab my phone to try and get a video, but the moment I reached for it, Sarah grabbed my arm. "Travis," she whispered, "something's not right." She was trembling, and I could feel her nails digging into my skin. The eyes hadn't moved, hadn't blinked. They just stayed fixed on us. I'm not sure what possessed me, but I stood up. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was that male bravado of wanting to protect our property, but I took a step toward the steps leading down from our porch. Sarah tried to stop me, but I assured her I just wanted to get a better look. The moment I put my foot on that first step, the most god-awful smell hit us. It was like a combination of wet dog, rotting meat, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. We had a pretty powerful LED flashlight on the porch table, one of those tactical ones that can light up pretty far. I reached for it, and that's when everything went to hell. The instant my hand touched the flashlight, there was this deafening crack, like someone had fired a shotgun right next to us. A massive branch, must have been at least 8 inches thick, came crashing down from one of the tall oaks at the edge of our property. The impact was so violent it made our wind chimes rattle. Sarah screamed and nearly knocked over her chair backing up. I'm not ashamed to admit I jumped too. The sound wasn't just loud, it had this deliberate quality to it, like it was meant to warn us. The craziest part? That branch showed no signs of disease or damage when we checked it the next day. It was a healthy piece of wood that had been literally ripped from the tree. The eyes disappeared the moment the branch fell, but what happened next still gives me chills. As the echo of the crash faded, we heard this sound. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a howl. It was deeper than both, something you felt in your chest more than heard with your ears. It came from much closer than where we'd seen the eyes, maybe 50 yards away now, off to our right. The smell got even stronger, and we could hear heavy footsteps moving through the undergrowth. That's when our motion sensor lights finally kicked on, illuminating the yard. Nothing was visible, but we could hear movement, heavy movement, just beyond where the light reached. Whatever it was big enough to make mature trees sway as it moved. The footsteps were unlike anything I've ever heard, not like a bear or a deer. They were deliberate, bipedal, and heavy enough to make the ground vibrate slightly. We didn't stay outside to investigate further. Sarah was already halfway through the door, and I wasn't far behind her. We locked everything up tight that night, doors, windows, even the garage. The smell lingered on our porch until morning, and we found some strange prints in the soft earth near where we'd heard the footsteps. They were about 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes, but the rain that came through the next day washed them away before I could properly document them. For the next few weeks, we kept hearing strange noises at night, wood knocks, deep grunts, and what sounded like rocks being clicked together. The activity gradually decreased, but we still catch whiffs of that distinctive smell occasionally, especially on warm, humid nights. We've installed more security lights and cameras since then, but whatever it was hasn't shown itself that clearly again. I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the area since that night. Turns out there have been several reports of similar incidents within a 20-mile radius of Duncan over the years, though most people keep quiet about it. The logical part of my brain wants to find a rational explanation, but I know what we saw. Those eyes were too high up to be any known animal, the branch snap was too deliberate, and that smell was something primal that triggered every fight or flight response in my body. We still live in the same house, still sit on our porch sometimes, but never after dark anymore. Sarah won't even go into the backyard alone at night. I've mounted additional security lights and keep that tactical flashlight handy, but part of me hopes we never see those eyes again. Whatever was watching us that night wasn't just passing through. It was studying us, testing our reactions. Sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I still get that feeling of being watched from the tree line, and I know in my gut that it's still out there, somewhere in those woods. The weirdest part? Since that night, we've noticed that the local wildlife behaves differently around our property. The deer that used to regularly visit our yard now give it a wide berth. Our neighbors' dogs refuse to come near the back fence line. It's like everything knows something we don't, and they're staying away for good reason. I've never been one for paranormal or cryptid stories, always figured there was a logical explanation for everything. But that night in October showed me that some things defy conventional explanation. I don't know what we encountered, but I know it was intelligent, it was powerful, and it wanted us to know it was there. Whether it was a warning or a demonstration, I'm still not sure. But one thing's certain, those woods behind our house hold secrets that I'm not sure I want to uncover. Story 4. What happened that night in September 2020 on my property in Welford, South Carolina, changed everything I thought I knew about the world. I'm not some conspiracy theorist or someone who goes looking for the paranormal. I'm just a regular guy who works in construction and lives on a modest 5-acre property with my German Shepherd, Duke. It was around 9:30 p.m. on a Tuesday night. The air was still warm from the late summer day, but there was this weird heaviness to it, like right before a storm. I remember because Duke had been acting strange all evening, pacing around the house, whining at nothing, and refusing to eat his dinner. At first I figured maybe he wasn't feeling well, but now I know better. He knew something was wrong before I did. I was getting ready to turn in for the night when Duke suddenly started barking, not his usual, "there's a deer in the yard" bark, but something more urgent, more aggressive. He was facing the back corner of our property, where it borders an old logging road and about 50 acres of dense woodland. The previous owner had cleared about an acre back there years ago, but it's mostly overgrown now with thick underbrush and young pines. When I went to check what had Duke so worked up, I noticed something odd right away. The usual nighttime sounds, Crickets, frogs, the occasional owl. They were just gone. The silence was so complete it felt like pressure in my ears. That's when I saw them. Two eyes reflecting in the darkness, about chest height if you were standing at the tree line. They weren't like any animal eyes I'd seen before, and living out here, I've seen plenty of deer, coyotes, and bobcats at night. These were different, larger, and spaced wider apart than any animal I could think of. I grabbed my heavy-duty maglite from the kitchen counter, the big aluminum one that could double as a weapon if needed. Duke was still barking, but he stayed close to my side instead of charging forward like he usually would with wildlife. That should have been my second warning. As I walked toward the tree line, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The eyes remained fixed in place, unmoving, unblinking. I estimated they were about 20 yards away, just at the edge where my cleared property meets the woods. Every step I took felt heavier than the last, like my body was trying to tell me to turn back. When I got about 60 feet from the tree line, everything went to hell. This sound erupted from where the eyes were. It started as a deep, guttural growl, but it wasn't like anything I've ever heard before. It was too deep for a bear, too powerful for a cougar, and had this almost mechanical quality to it, like metal grinding on metal underneath the organic sound. The hair on my arms stood up, and I felt this primal urge to run. I raised my flashlight, and what I saw in that beam of light still haunts my dreams. The creature was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders that seemed to melt into the darkness around it. But it was the face that turned my blood to ice. It was like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. One moment, it looked like a panther's face, sleek and predatory. Then, without actually moving or changing, it seemed to shift into something like a pit bull's muzzle, but wrong somehow, too angular, too long. And then, God help me, it looked almost human but distorted, like someone had tried to sculpt a human face without ever having seen one. The whole time, those eyes never blinked. They were amber-colored, but would occasionally catch the light of my flashlight and shine with an unnatural red gleam. The pupils were wrong too. Not round like a human's or slitted like a cat's, but somewhere in between, and they seemed to pulse slightly, like a heart beating. Duke, my brave, protective German shepherd, who once chased off a black bear, was pressing himself against my legs, trembling. He was making this high-pitched whine I'd never heard from him before or since, like he was trying to cry, but couldn't quite manage it. What happened next is still hard for me to process. The creature took a step forward, and I noticed its movement was all wrong. It was fluid but jerky at the same time, like watching a stop-motion animation in real life. Its arms, and I hesitate to call them arms because they seemed too long and had too many joints, hung down past its knees, ending in what looked like hands, but with fingers that were definitely too long and too numerous. That's when I heard it. A voice, but not from the creature. It came from behind it, deeper in the woods, and it sounded like someone trying to imitate a coyote's howl while underwater. The creature's head snapped toward the sound with a movement so fast it blurred, and that's when I saw its neck was too long and seemed to bend in places it shouldn't. The thing looked back at me one last time, and I swear I saw intelligence in those eyes. Not animal intelligence, but something else. Something that understood things I hope I never have to understand. Then it moved. I've seen videos of bears running through brush, of moose plowing through small trees. This was different. The creature didn't push through the vegetation. It moved through it like a hot knife through butter. Young trees, thick brush, it didn't matter. Everything in its path was just pushed aside or down, not broken or trampled, but bent in ways that plants shouldn't bend. The sound was like 1,000 green branches being stretched to their limit all at once, followed by this weird popping noise that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, my flashlight beam shaking as I pointed it where the creature had vanished. The silence was still absolute, but now it felt different, expectant, like the woods themselves were holding their breath. Finally, Duke's whining snapped me out of it. We backed away slowly, never turning our backs to the woods until we reached the house. I locked every door and window. Not that I think it would have mattered if that thing wanted to get in. The next morning I went to check the area. The damage to the vegetation was real. A clear path about 8 feet wide, where everything was pushed flat to the ground. But here's the weird part. By noon, all the plants had started to straighten up again, like they were never disturbed. By the next day, you couldn't tell anything had happened there at all. I know how this sounds. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw. Stress, weird lighting tricks, maybe even some kind of mass hallucination between me and Duke. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was not anything that should exist in our world. Duke never goes to that part of the property anymore. He'll walk anywhere else, but if I try to lead him toward that back corner, he plants his feet and refuses to move. Can't say I blame him. I don't go back there after dark either. I've heard stories since then, whispers from other people in the area about strange sightings and unexplained phenomena. Some talk about missing pets, others about strange sounds in the night. But nobody talks about it openly. It's like there's this unspoken agreement that we don't discuss these things in the light of day. I still live here. I've thought about moving, but where would I go? How do I know I wouldn't run into something worse somewhere else? At least here, I know what area to avoid. I've installed more security lights, and I never go outside at night without my flashlight and Duke. But sometimes, on particularly quiet nights, I'll hear that underwater coyote sound from deep in the woods, and I know it's still out there, whatever it is. I don't expect anyone to believe me. Hell, some days I'm not sure I believe it myself. But I know what I saw that night, and I know that there are things in this world that we're not meant to understand. Things that exist in the spaces between what we think is possible and what actually is. And sometimes, if we're very unlucky, we catch a glimpse of them. Story 5. I've never told many people about what happened that day in Union County back in '94. I was 13, almost 14, and until then, hunting with my dad was just something normal we did together. But that November morning changed everything I thought I knew about our woods. It was November 12th, 1994. I remember the date clearly because it was the weekend before my cousin's birthday, and I was supposed to go to his party the following week. The morning started like any other hunting trip. Dad woke me up at 4:30 a.m. and I grabbed my warm clothes and gear that we'd laid out the night before. We lived about 40 minutes from our usual hunting spot in Union County, just off Highway 49, near the edge of the Sumter National Forest. Dad was a big guy, about 6'1", and built like a linebacker from his construction work. He always made me feel safe in the woods, like nothing could possibly go wrong as long as he was there. That morning was cold, probably in the low 40s, and there was this thick fog hanging between the trees that made everything look kind of ghostly. We'd been tracking a decent-sized buck for the past couple of weekends, and Dad was sure we'd get him this time. We parked the truck around 5:30 a.m. and hiked about a mile into the woods to our favorite spot. Dad had set up a ground blind the previous weekend, and we settled in just as the sky was starting to lighten up. The fog was still pretty thick, but you could see maybe 100 yards or so through the trees. Everything was quiet, except for the occasional crow and the wind in the trees. Around 8:30, after sitting still for what felt like forever, Dad whispered that he needed to take a leak and would be right back. He grabbed his rifle, always careful about safety, and walked about 50 yards behind our blind. I stayed put, scanning the woods ahead of me with my binoculars like he'd taught me. That's when everything changed. I was focusing on this fallen oak tree about 80 yards ahead when I noticed something off. At first I thought it was just part of the tree trunk, maybe some weird shadow or moss. But then it moved, just slightly, but enough to make my heart skip a beat. I adjusted my binoculars, and that's when I saw it clearly. There was something massive sitting on that fallen tree. The thing that struck me first wasn't even its size, though that hit me seconds later. It was the way it was sitting. It was human-like, not like a bear or any animal I'd ever seen. It was just sitting there, one leg kind of propped up, almost casual-like. But what really got me was its covering. It wasn't fur, at least not entirely. It looked like it had this greyish, bark-like covering, almost like tree camouflage, but it seemed natural, like it was part of whatever this thing was. My hands started shaking so bad I could barely hold the binoculars steady. The creature had to be at least 8 feet tall, even sitting down. I could tell because that fallen oak was pretty big, and this thing made it look small. What really got me, though, What made my blood run cold was its face. It had this thick, pronounced beard, almost like Spanish moss but more solid. And its eyes. They were looking right at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't even think about calling out to my dad. The thing just sat there, studying me. It wasn't aggressive or threatening, it was just watching. Like it was as curious about me as I was terrified of it. The fog had lifted some by then, and the morning sun was filtering through the trees, which made the whole scene feel even more surreal. I don't know how long we stayed like that, locked in this weird staring contest. Could have been seconds or minutes. Time kind of lost all meaning. What I do remember is the absolute silence. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. Then I heard my dad's footsteps coming back through the leaves behind me. Just the normal crunch of boots on fallen leaves, but it sounded like explosions in that silence. I wanted to turn around, to warn him or something, but I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. I was afraid it would, I don't know, charge us or disappear or something if I looked away. But then it moved. It was so smooth, so deliberate. No rushed movements, no dramatic gestures. It just stood up. That's when the full size of it hit me. My dad, who I always thought was huge, would have looked like a kid next to this thing. It had to be at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. Its shoulders were massive, like a buffalo's, and that bark-like covering shifted with its movements in a way that seemed impossible. Instead of running or walking away, it just stepped behind a large pine tree. But here's the thing that still haunts me. The tree wasn't nearly wide enough to hide something that big. It should have been visible on either side. But it wasn't. It was just gone. My dad came up beside me right then and must have noticed something was wrong because he grabbed my shoulder and asked if I was okay. I was shaking so bad I could barely point to where the creature had been. Dad, being Dad, immediately went into protective mode. He kept his rifle ready and walked over to the fallen tree where I'd seen it sitting. I didn't want him to go, but I also didn't want to be left alone, so I followed him, staying close behind. When we got there, the log was still warm where it had been sitting. Dad found some weird marks in the bark, almost like pressure points where something heavy had been, but nothing definitive. No footprints in the leaves or soil, no broken branches, no hair or other evidence. Just that warm spot on the log and those strange impressions. We searched the area for almost 2 hours, but found nothing else. Dad tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear, though we both knew bears don't sit like that. Maybe it was just shadows and fog playing tricks, but that didn't explain the warm log. Maybe I dozed off and dreamed it, but I knew I hadn't. We left early that day, something we'd never done before on a hunting trip. The whole drive home, I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to make sense of it. Dad didn't say much, but I could tell he was troubled. He'd seen the warm spot on the log, the strange marks. He knew something had been there, something that shouldn't exist. For weeks afterward, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that creature's face, those eyes studying me. I kept thinking about how it had just disappeared, like it had stepped into another world behind that tree. Dad and I never went back to that specific spot again. We still hunted, but always in different areas. The weirdest part? A few months later, I overheard some guys at the local diner talking about something huge they'd seen in the woods near where our encounter had happened. They described the same bark-like covering, the same impossible way of disappearing. But I never said anything. Who would believe a 13-year-old kid? I'm 43 now, and I've spent countless hours researching similar encounters in the Union County area. There have been other sightings over the years, some with details eerily similar to what I saw. That bark-like covering shows up in other reports, though not many. Most people describe fur, but I know what I saw. Dad passed away last year, and at his funeral, he pulled me aside and finally talked about that day. He admitted that he'd seen something moving through the trees when he was walking back to the blind, something huge that shouldn't have been able to move that quietly. He'd never told me because he thought it would scare me more. I still go hunting, but now I'm the one taking my kid. Every time we're in the woods, I scan the trees, half hoping, half dreading to see that bark-like covering again. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in thick and the woods go quiet, I swear I can feel eyes watching me, studying me, just like they did that November morning in '94. I don't know what it was. I can't explain how something that big could just vanish, or why it was covered in what looked like tree bark, or why it chose to let me see it that day. All I know is that it was real, it was intelligent, and it changed how I see our woods forever. Sometimes I wonder if it's still out there, sitting on fallen logs, watching other people walk by, deciding who gets to see it and who doesn't. Story 6. I'm a Vietnam vet, served 2 tours back in '68, '70. After coming home, I bought a decent-sized piece of land out in Rolling Fork, Mississippi, right near the Big Black River. It's about 40 acres of mostly wooded area with some cleared spaces where I built my house. Always figured the isolation would help with the PTSD, and for the most part, it did. But what I never expected was to end up sharing my land with a family of creatures that most people think don't exist. It started around 1999. I'd noticed things going missing from my apple trees, not just a few fruits here and there, but entire branches stripped clean. At first I blamed it on deer or bears, though we rarely get bears in this part of Mississippi. Then I started finding footprints. Not animal tracks, not human prints, something else entirely. They were huge, easily 16, 17 inches long with 5 distinct toes. The stride length between prints was massive, sometimes over 4 feet apart. I served in the jungle. I know what it feels like to be watched. That sixth sense you develop never really leaves you. I started feeling it again on my own property, especially near dusk when I'd be working in my garden or checking my fence line. The hair on the back of my neck would stand up, and all the normal forest sounds would just stop. The first time I actually saw one of them, I was fixing a broken section of fence near the river, late afternoon in early autumn. There was this smell, kind of musky, like wet dog mixed with something earthy. Then I heard branches cracking, way too high up to be a deer. When I turned around, there it was, standing partially behind a large oak about 50 yards away. A male, built like a bodybuilder but much, much taller, probably around 8 feet. Dark brown, almost black hair covering its entire body, but its face, that's what got me. It looked way too human, with expressive eyes that showed clear intelligence. I didn't run. Maybe it was the military training, or maybe I was just too shocked. But I stood my ground. We just stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then it slowly backed away into the thicker brush. I could hear it moving through the woods for a while after I lost sight of it. Over the next few weeks, I started leaving apples out near that same spot. They'd always be gone by morning. Eventually, I set up a basic feeding station, just a wooden platform about chest high where I'd leave fruit. That's when I started seeing them more regularly, and I realized there weren't just one, but 3 of them. The male I'd seen first was the one who'd usually come to get the food. But there was also a female, even taller than him, probably close to 9 feet with slightly lighter colored hair. And then there was a younger one, looked like a teenager if you can believe it, skinnier than the others but still around 7 or 2 inches or so. They moved like a family unit. I know how this sounds. Trust me, I do. I've questioned my sanity more times than I can count. But after years of observation, I can tell you these creatures are real, and they're far more intelligent than any ape. They use basic tools. I've seen the younger one using a stick to reach apples from higher branches. They communicate with each other through a series of low whoops and what sounds almost like whispered speech. They're careful, incredibly careful. In all these years, I never managed to get a clear photo. Believe me, I tried. Every time I set up a game camera, they'd either avoid the area completely or somehow disable it. It's like they understood what the devices were. The few times I did catch anything on camera, it was just shadows or partial glimpses that could be explained away as anything. The family stayed on my property for years, mostly keeping to themselves, but occasionally letting me observe them from a distance. They seemed to understand boundaries, never came too close to my house, never bothered my vehicles or equipment. We had an understanding, I guess you could say. Last year something changed. The apples started going untouched. The familiar feeling of being watched disappeared. I found some unusual tracks heading south, deeper into the swamp areas, like they were moving on. Then nothing. Complete silence. That's when Travis, a buddy of mine who'd gotten interested in my stories, wanted to come check things out for himself. But I got sick before he could make it out here. Now I'm writing this down because I don't know how much longer I've got, and somebody needs to know the truth. These creatures exist. They're not monsters. They're not mindless beasts. They're a family, intelligent beings trying to survive in a world that's getting smaller and less wild every day. I've got journals full of observations, feeding patterns, behavior notes, rough sketches of their appearances, detailed records of every interaction over 2 decades. But what stands out most isn't the physical evidence. It's the moments of unexpected intelligence and almost human-like behavior I witnessed. Like the time the younger one was injured, I never figured out how, and the parents took turns bringing it food for several days. Or how they seemed to mourn when one of the older trees on my property fell during a storm, standing around it for hours making soft vocalizations. The male would sometimes leave broken branches in specific patterns near my feeding station, 3 parallel sticks laid out perfectly straight, or small saplings bent into arch shapes. At first I thought it was random, but it happened too often to be coincidence. It felt like communication, though I never figured out what they were trying to say. They were most active at dawn and dusk, but occasionally I'd catch glimpses of them on bright moonlit nights. Their eyeshine was amber-colored, visible from hundreds of yards away. During winter months, their coats would get thicker and slightly lighter in color. They seemed to prefer the densest parts of the forest near the river, where the undergrowth was so thick you couldn't walk through it without making noise. I'm writing this now because I know my time's getting short, and I need someone to know what happened here. These creatures are real, they're out there, and they're so much more than just the monsters people make them out to be. They're family-oriented, intelligent, and capable of complex behaviors we probably can't even understand. To anyone who might read this, I know it sounds crazy, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that every word is true. I lived with these beings on my land for over 20 years. I watched them, learned from them, and developed a respect for them that I can't quite put into words. They're not missing links or supernatural beings. They're just another species trying to survive, smarter than we give them credit for, and much better at staying hidden than we can imagine. I don't know where they went or why they left. Part of me hopes they found somewhere safer, somewhere further from civilization. But another part of me worries that their disappearance means something worse. All I know is that for 2 decades, I shared my land with something extraordinary, something that most people will never believe in. And now that they're gone, the woods feel empty in a way I can't explain. This is my story. Take it for what you will. But know that out there in the forests of Mississippi, there are things that science hasn't explained yet. Things that are way more intelligent and complex than we give them credit for. I know because I lived with them. And no matter what anyone says, I know what I saw. Story 7. I've been driving trucks for over 15 years, and what happened to me last September on Highway 143 near Millbrook, Alabama, still keeps me up some nights. I've run that route hundreds of times, but I've never pulled over at that particular spot before or since. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if I just pushed on to Montgomery like I usually do. It was around 2:30 a.m. on a Thursday when I started feeling the fatigue hitting hard. You know that feeling when your eyes get heavy and you catch yourself nodding off? After nearly rear-ending a car a few miles back, I knew I needed to stop. There was this wide gravel turnout about 10 miles north of Millbrook that seemed good enough. No other trucks or cars around, just dense woods on both sides of the highway. The moon was nearly full that night, which helped with visibility. I remember checking my phone, 2:43 a.m. exactly, and texting my wife that I was taking a quick break. The plan was to catch maybe an hour of sleep before finishing the last leg of my route. I always keep my doors locked when I sleep, force of habit from years on the road. The night was unusually quiet. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. Looking back, that should have been my first warning sign. I just started dozing off when I heard this weird sound, like branches breaking, but not the normal way they snap when deer walk through. These were thick branches, and the breaks sounded deliberate, almost rhythmic. At first I tried to ignore it, thinking it was probably just some animal. But then I felt my truck shift slightly, like something heavy was moving nearby. My hand was shaking when I reached for my maglite. I always keep it in the side compartment, along with my thermal coffee mug and some snacks. Through the windshield, I could see movement between the trees about 30 yards ahead. Not like wind moving the branches, but something large pushing through them. What happened next? I've replayed it in my head thousands of times. I switched on the flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. That's when I saw it. Jesus Christ, I still get goosebumps thinking about it. This thing was massive, easily 8, maybe 9 feet tall. It wasn't a bear. Bears don't stand like that, and they sure as hell don't have that kind of build. It was standing completely upright, like a person but much bigger, with broad shoulders and long arms that hung down past its knees. The creature was covered in dark, matted fur, not black exactly, more like a deep brown. In the flashlight beam, I could see it was dirty and tangled, with what looked like twigs or leaves stuck in it. But what really got me was its face. I only saw it for a few seconds, but those eyes, they reflected my flashlight like a deer's would, but there was something intelligent there, something aware. The face was flat, almost human-like, but with a prominent brow ridge and a wide, lipless mouth. The smell hit me next. This awful combination of wet dog, rotting vegetation, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water, even inside the cab with the windows up. I've smelled a lot of dead animals on the road, but this was different, more pungent, more alive. It was just standing there watching my truck, not moving, not making a sound, just watching. I felt frozen in place, my hand still gripping the flashlight so hard my knuckles were white. Then it shifted its weight and I swear to God my whole truck rocked slightly. That's when I dropped the flashlight and scrambled to get my key in the ignition. The moment I started the engine, this sound came from outside. Not quite a roar, not quite a growl, but something in between. It was deep, like it was coming from the bottom of a well, and it made the windows vibrate. I've never heard anything like it before or since. It wasn't just loud, it felt like it went right through me. I threw the truck into gear and got the hell out of there, not even bothering to check my mirrors until I was doing 70 down the highway. When I finally did look back, I couldn't see anything in the darkness behind me, but that smell, it stuck around in my clothes and the cab for days. I had to get the interior detailed twice before it finally went away. I filed a report with the local sheriff's department the next day, but I could tell they didn't take it seriously. The deputy just nodded and said they'd look into it. When I went back to the spot a week later in daylight, I found some broken branches and what might have been footprints in the soft ground near where I'd parked, but the recent rain had mostly washed them away. I've talked to other truckers who run that route, and a few of them have had weird experiences in that area. Strange noises, unexplained movements in the trees, that same terrible smell. But nobody's seen what I saw, at least not that clearly. I still drive that stretch of highway sometimes, have to for work, but I never stop there anymore, not for any reason. The thing that really gets me, even now, is how deliberate it all felt. This wasn't just some animal acting on instinct. Whatever I saw that night was watching me, studying me. Sometimes I wonder if it had been following my truck for a while before I stopped, waiting for me to pull over. I've hauled cargo through every state east of the Mississippi, seen all kinds of wildlife, but nothing comes close to what I encountered that night. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, if someone had told me this same story before it happened, I probably wouldn't have believed them either. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, and it was intelligent. And the worst part is, I'm pretty sure it's still out there, somewhere in those woods along Highway 143, waiting for the next person to pull over for arrest. I've never been a believer in the supernatural or any of that Bigfoot stuff you see on TV. I'm just a regular guy who drives a truck for a living. But that night changed everything I thought I knew about what's possible. These days, I keep my stops to well-lit rest areas and truck stops. And every time I pass that turnout, even in broad daylight, I can't help but scan the tree line, half expecting to see those eyes watching me again. Story 8. It was July 15th, 2021. We'd driven up from Phoenix to escape the brutal heat, planning to spend a few days camping in the forest near Pine Top. The rangers at the station said the area was pretty quiet that week, just a few other campers spread out across different sites. We found a nice spot about 2 miles from the main road, surrounded by towering ponderosa pines. The weather was perfect, mid-70s, slight breeze, not a cloud in sight. We set up our campsite around 2 p.m. Nothing fancy, just our 4-person tent, a folding table for food prep, and our camping chairs. We'd brought plenty of supplies, cooler full of food, fruits, granola bars, the usual stuff. I remember specifically arranging everything on that wooden picnic table. Sarah always teases me about being overly organized when we camp. We had apples, oranges, and some peaches sitting in a mesh bag to keep the bugs off. The day was completely normal. We hiked a bit, made hot dogs for dinner, and turned in around 10 p.m. I'm usually a pretty light sleeper when we're camping, but that night I crashed hard. Maybe it was the hiking or the mountain air, I don't know. It must have been around 2:30 a.m. when I first heard it. You know that feeling when something just isn't right? The forest had gone dead silent. No crickets, no nightbirds, nothing. Just this heavy stillness. Then came the footsteps, not like a deer or elk. These were heavy, deliberate. The sound of pine needles and twigs crunching under significant weight. Sarah was already awake, gripping my arm. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I could feel her trembling. The footsteps were circling our tent, maybe 15 feet out at first, then gradually getting closer. Whatever it was big, really big. Then the smell hit us, this overwhelming musty odor, like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I've been around bears before, but this was different. I don't even know how to describe it. The footsteps stopped right by our tent. We could see it through the tent material. This massive silhouette outlined against the moonlight. Had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. This thing was standing on 2 legs, with these long arms that hung down past its knees. I've never felt so utterly helpless. We were frozen, barely breathing. Sarah was silently crying next to me. Our car was about 40 yards away and my gun was locked in the trunk like an idiot. All we could do was lie there and watch this creature's shadow through the tent wall. Then it moved toward our picnic table. We could hear it moving things around, followed by this deep, guttural breathing. Not growling exactly, but these low, rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the ground. The creature was picking through our food. We could hear the mesh fruit bag rustling. What happened next still gives me chills. It started eating. We could hear the distinct sound of teeth crunching into apples, but the way it ate was almost deliberate. Not like an animal ravaging food. It was picking up individual pieces of fruit, eating them one at a time. Between bites, it would make these low, almost sighing sounds. This went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 15, 20 minutes. The whole time we didn't move a muscle. I kept thinking about making a break for the car, but something told me that would be a terrible idea. Whatever this thing was, it was between us and our only escape route. Around this time, it did something that nearly stopped my heart. It walked back toward our tent, closer than before. The silhouette was massive, broad shoulders, long arms, a clearly defined head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with barely any neck. It just stood there, maybe 5 feet from the tent, breathing. The smell was overwhelming. Then it made this sound, not quite a growl, not quite speech, but something in between. A deep, rumbling vocalization that seemed to carry meaning. The air felt heavy, electric almost. I swear I could feel its presence pressing down on us through the tent. After what felt like an eternity, it finally moved away. The footsteps grew fainter, heading north into the deeper forest. Even after we couldn't hear it anymore, we stayed completely still for at least another hour. Neither of us slept a wink. When the first light of dawn finally came around 5 a.m., we practically ran to the car. The picnic table was a mess. Our fruit bag was torn open, with half-eaten apples and peaches scattered around. But here's the weird part. Nothing else was touched. Not our cooler, not our other food, just the fruit. We found footprints, huge ones, easily 16 inches long. They were deep too, like whatever made them was incredibly heavy. They came from the north, circled our campsite several times, and headed back the same way. The stride length was massive, easily 4 or 5 feet between prints. I took photos of the prints with my phone, but they came out blurry in the early morning light. We were so shaken, we just threw everything in the car and got out of there. We filed a report with the Forest Service later that day, but I could tell by their faces they didn't really believe us. They suggested it was probably a bear, even though the footprints clearly showed a bipedal creature. Sarah and I have been camping our whole lives. We know what bears sound like, how they move, how they behave. This was something else entirely. The deliberate movement, the way it ate, that horrible smell, and most of all, those sounds it made. They seemed almost like attempts at communication. We haven't been camping since then. Sometimes I lie awake at night, remembering that sound it made near our tent, that almost speech that seemed to carry some kind of meaning. I find myself wondering what it was trying to say, and whether we were just lucky that night, or if it deliberately chose to leave us alone. I know how this story might sound to most people. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I probably wouldn't believe it either. But I know what we saw and heard that night. Whatever it wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal. There's something out there in those woods, something that most people aren't ready to acknowledge. And the scariest part, I'm convinced it's far more intelligent than we give it credit for. Story 9. It was mid-October 2018, and I'd been tracking elk movements in the area for a seasonal migration project. The weather had been unusually warm for that time of year, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with clear skies and barely any wind. I'd found this perfect spot about 8 miles east of Concrete, where a small creek cuts through dense forest. There were fresh elk tracks everywhere, and I'd noticed they were using this creek as a regular watering hole. I arrived early that morning around 5:30 a.m., while it was still dark. I always like setting up before sunrise to catch the morning activity. The spot was pretty remote. Took me about an hour and a half of hiking from where I parked my truck off Forest Service Road 17. I'd been there several times before, so I knew the area well. The creek bank had these natural clearings that made for perfect camera positions, and the surrounding old-growth forest created natural funnels where animals would pass through. I set up 3 Browning trail cameras with infrared sensors. These weren't cheap cameras either. I'd invested in the latest models that could capture high-resolution images, even in low light. I positioned them carefully, one facing directly across the creek, another angled upstream where I'd seen most of the elk tracks, and the third downstream where the bank sloped gently to the water. I checked and double-checked all the settings, made sure the motion sensors were properly calibrated, and secured them firmly to 3 separate trees about 15 feet from the water's edge. Something felt off that morning, though. Usually the forest would be alive with bird sounds as the sun came up, but it was unusually quiet. I figured maybe it was just the weather change or something. I spent about an hour getting everything set up and then headed back to my truck. The plan was to leave the cameras for 24 hours to capture a full day-night cycle of wildlife activity. The next morning, I got back to the site around the same time. The silence hit me again, but this time it felt heavier, more oppressive. As I approached the first camera location, I noticed something wasn't right. The air had this strange, musty smell, kind of like wet dog mixed with something rotten. I've spent enough time in the woods to know the usual smells, but this was different. It made my stomach turn. The first camera was completely destroyed, not just damaged. It looked like something had literally crushed it in half. These cameras are built tough, designed to withstand bear attacks and severe weather. Whatever did this had to be incredibly strong. The memory card was somehow still intact, though bent. The second camera downstream was missing entirely. I found pieces of it scattered in a 20-foot radius, including chunks of the protective casing that had deep scratches in them. My hands were shaking as I approached the third camera. It was still attached to the tree, but had been twisted at an odd angle. The protective case was cracked, but the camera itself seemed functional. I could tell something had tried to get it off the tree, but hadn't quite managed to. The bark around the mounting straps was deeply scored, with marks that looked like they were made by huge fingers. I pulled the memory cards from the first and third cameras, the second one's card was nowhere to be found, and plugged them into my laptop right there. What I saw made my blood run cold. The first camera had captured something around 2:13 a.m. The infrared shots showed a massive figure crouching by the water's edge. It was huge. Using the trees in the background for scale, I'd estimate at least 9 feet tall if it had been standing upright. The creature was covered in thick dark hair, but what really got me were its hands. They were clearly visible as it scooped water to its mouth, long fingers, almost human-like but massive in scale. The face was partially visible in profile, a pronounced brow ridge and what looked like a flattened nose. This wasn't a bear. Bears don't have hands like that. Bears don't have faces like that. The sequence lasted about 30 seconds, 6 clear shots of the creature drinking, then suddenly looking up as if startled. The final image showed it beginning to stand, turning toward the camera. After that, nothing, just blank frames until the memory card ended. The third camera had captured something even more chilling. Around 3:45 a.m., it caught what looked like the same creature, but this time it was clearly agitated. The shots showed it methodically destroying the second camera, ripping it from the tree with those long-fingered hands. The clarity of these images was incredible. You could see the muscles moving under the hair, the way its shoulders bunched as it pulled at the camera. The hair wasn't just dark, it had a reddish-brown tint in places. In one frame, it looked directly at the third camera, and I could see its eyes reflecting the infrared light. I've never packed up my gear so fast in my life. That oppressive silence suddenly made sense. Every animal in the area must have sensed this thing's presence and gone quiet. As I was hurrying back to my truck, I kept smelling that same musty odor, stronger in some places than others, like whatever it was had moved through the area recently. I made it back to my vehicle and drove straight home. I spent hours examining those photos, trying to convince myself they were somehow fake, that maybe someone was playing an elaborate prank. But I know what I saw. Those images showed something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything I thought I knew about North American wildlife. I still have the photos, though I haven't shared them publicly. Part of me wants to, but another part knows what would happen. They'd be dismissed as fakes, or I'd be labeled as another crazy person seeing Bigfoot. But I know what I captured. Those hands, that face, the sheer size of it. It was real, too real. I haven't been back to that specific location since. I've done wildlife photography in other areas, but something changed after that day. Every time I'm in the woods now, I feel like I'm being watched. That musty smell occasionally catches my nose, even in places dozens of miles from that creek, and my blood runs cold. The thing that really keeps me up at night isn't just what I saw in those photos. It's knowing that this creature was intelligent enough to understand what the cameras were and methodically destroy them. It knew it was being recorded. It didn't just randomly smash things, it specifically targeted the cameras, and the way it looked directly into the last camera before destroying it. There was intelligence in those eyes, awareness. I've heard other stories about similar encounters in the Cascade Mountains, but I never gave them much credence until now. I understand why people keep these experiences to themselves. Who would believe it? But I know what I saw. Those images are burned into my memory, and that musty smell still hits me in my nightmares. The worst part is the uncertainty, not knowing if it's still out there, watching, waiting. Every snapped twig in the forest makes me jump now. Every shadow could be that massive figure. I still do wildlife photography, but I've switched to using mobile blinds and staying with my equipment. No more leaving cameras overnight. No more solo trips to remote locations. Some things in nature, I've learned, are better left unobserved. Story 10. It all started in early October 2022. We live about 15 miles outside of town, in a pretty remote area backed up against the Monongahela National Forest. Our closest neighbor is about half a mile down the road. We've lived here for almost 8 years, and we're used to dealing with bears and other wildlife getting into our trash. But this was different. At first, it seemed like typical bear activity. Our garbage cans knocked over in the morning, trash scattered across the yard. We'd dealt with this before, so I didn't think much of it. But after the third night in a row, I noticed something odd. The trash wasn't just scattered randomly. Certain items were missing, particularly our food containers and anything with strong smells. The really weird part, the lids weren't damaged or thrown aside. They were carefully removed and placed next to the cans. My wife Sarah kept telling me it had to be raccoons or maybe some teenagers messing with us, but I've dealt with raccoons before. They're messy. This was methodical. The creature was selective about what it took, and it wasn't leaving behind the usual mess that bears or raccoons make. Plus, our motion-activated floodlights never triggered, which was strange because they always catch the deer and other animals that wander into our yard. After about a week of this, I decided to set up my trail camera. I've used it for hunting season before, so I knew exactly where to mount it to get a good view of our trash area. I secured it to a tree about 15 feet up, angled down toward our 3 garbage cans. The camera had night vision and motion detection, and I made sure to set it to record video instead of just taking photos. The first 2 nights, nothing. But on October 12th, around 3:15 a.m., it caught something that still makes my skin crawl when I think about it. The video starts with our garbage area completely still. The floodlights are off, and you can only see what the camera's infrared reveals. Then, from the tree line to the left, something moves. At first it looks like a shadow, but as it enters the frame fully, you can see its size. This thing was huge. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The way it moved, that's what really got to me. It wasn't lumbering like a bear. It walked upright, smoothly, almost like a person, but with a much longer stride. The creature approached the garbage cans, and this is where it gets really unsettling. It didn't just start ripping into them like an animal would. It squatted down, a very human-like motion, and carefully lifted the lid off the first can, setting it quietly on the ground. The way its arms moved, the deliberate nature of its actions, this was no bear. The infrared showed its fur clearly, thick and matted in some areas, longer around the shoulders. But it was the hands that really shook me. They were huge, but they worked with a dexterity that I still can't explain. It spent about 10 minutes going through our garbage, picking out specific items and examining them. It seemed particularly interested in the takeout containers from when we'd had Chinese food earlier that week. At one point, it actually opened one of the containers and sniffed inside. The whole time it kept looking over its shoulder, scanning the area like it knew it shouldn't be there. What really sends chills down my spine is what happened next. As it was going through the second can, a car drove past on the main road about 200 yards away. The creature's head snapped up immediately, and it went completely still. The way it reacted, it wasn't startled like an animal. It was calculating. It waited, completely motionless, until the car's lights had completely faded. Then, with deliberate movements, it replaced the lids on both cans it had opened. But here's the part that still haunts me. Before it left, it turned and looked directly at the camera. I swear it knew it was being filmed. The infrared showed its face clearly for just a moment. Broad, with a pronounced brow ridge and deep-set eyes that reflected the infrared light. It held that gaze for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. Then it turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the tree line with an unnervingly quiet grace for something so large. I spent the rest of that night watching and re-watching the footage, trying to convince myself it was someone in a suit. But the proportions were wrong. The arms too long, the shoulders too wide. The way it moved was too fluid, too natural, and nobody in a suit could have moved that quietly or handled objects with such precision while wearing huge costume hands. The next morning, I went out to check the area. The garbage cans were exactly as they appeared in the video, lids placed neatly beside them. But what I found in the soil nearby made my blood run cold. There were footprints, huge ones, at least 16 inches long. They were deep too, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. I tried to take pictures, but the morning dew had already started to soften the impressions. I showed the video to Sarah, and for the first time, she didn't have a rational explanation. We debated calling the police or the Game Commission, but what would we say? That Bigfoot was going through our trash? We'd sound crazy. Instead, we started bringing our garbage cans into the garage at night. The strange thing is, after we started doing that, we began noticing other things. Food would go missing from our back porch. We had a habit of leaving fresh vegetables from our garden out there to sort through. One morning, all our tomatoes were gone. Another time, a whole basket of apples disappeared. We never caught these incidents on camera, but somehow that made it even more unsettling. This went on for about 2 weeks. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more missing food, no more garbage disturbances. The last sign we had was a series of weird whooping calls from the forest one night, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. They seemed to be moving away from our property, heading deeper into the national forest. I've spent countless hours trying to make sense of what happened. I've researched similar incidents in the area, and there are more than you'd think. Lost Creek and the surrounding forest have a history of strange sightings going back decades. Some local hunters have stories that sound eerily similar to what we experienced. The video is still on my trail camera's SD card. I've thought about sharing it online, but I know what would happen. People would call it a hoax, analyze every frame looking for strings or signs of editing. But I know what I saw. That thing was real, it was intelligent, and it was definitely not a normal animal. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear unusual sounds from the woods behind our house. Deep, resonant whoops that don't match any known wildlife in the area. I've installed more security cameras around our property, but we haven't caught anything as clear as that first video. Maybe it learned, adapted, and started avoiding the cameras. That thought might be the scariest part of all. The idea that it's still out there, watching, learning, and becoming more cautious. I don't expect everyone to believe this story, but I know what I saw. That night changed how I view the woods around our home. There are things out there that defy explanation, things that blur the line between animal and human intelligence, and sometimes they come right up to our doors, curious about us just as we are about them. Story 11. It was November 12th, a Thursday. I remember it clearly because I'd taken a long weekend off work specifically for deer season. The weather that morning was unusually warm for November, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light fog that had settled in the valley. I'd been in my tree stand since 4:30 a.m., about 20 feet up in an old oak tree that gave me a good view of a natural funnel where two ridges came together. My stand was deep in the woods, probably about 3 miles from the nearest paved road. It's private land that's been in my family for generations. 180 acres of dense forest that backs up against thousands of acres of public land. I know every inch of that property, or at least I thought I did. Around 7:15 a.m., the fog started lifting, and I was getting that golden morning light that makes everything look crisp and clear. I'd seen a few does earlier, but they were too far for a clean shot. The woods were alive with normal morning sounds, squirrels chattering, birds calling, the occasional branch creaking in the light breeze. That's when everything changed. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't gradual, it was like someone had hit a mute button. The squirrels stopped, the birds went quiet. Even the wind seemed to die down. Every hunter knows that sudden silence usually means something big is moving through the woods, but this was different. The silence felt heavy, wrong. I remember getting this intense feeling of being watched. You know that feeling when someone's staring at you in a crowd? Multiply that by 100. The hair on the back of my neck stood up and my mouth went dry. I've been hunting for 25 years and I've never felt anything like it. Then came the smell. I know what a bear smells like. I know what deer, coyotes, and every other animal in these woods smells like. This was something else entirely. It was this powerful, musky odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I heard it before I saw it. Heavy footsteps, but not like a deer or bear. These were deliberate bipedal steps. Crack, crunch, crack. Whatever it was big and walking on 2 legs. The sound was coming from the north side of the ridge, moving parallel to my position. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my rifle. I'm not ashamed to admit I was terrified. Something in my gut was screaming that this was wrong, that I shouldn't be seeing what I was about to see. Then it stepped into view, and my whole world shifted. The creature, and I don't know what else to call it, was carrying a dead deer like it was nothing more than a grocery bag. The deer was a good-sized buck, probably 180 pounds, but this thing had it slung over one shoulder like it weighed nothing. The creature itself, God, I still see it when I close my eyes. It was tall, really tall. I'm good at estimating distances and sizes, comes with hunting, and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its arms were impossibly long, hanging almost to its knees, The whole body was covered in dark brown, almost black hair. Not fur like a bear, this was more like human hair, but thicker, matted in some places. The way it moved, that's what really got me. It wasn't lumbering or awkward like you'd expect something that big to be. It moved smoothly, almost gracefully, stepping over fallen logs and pushing through brush like it knew exactly where to place its feet. What happened next will haunt me forever. It stopped. Just stopped dead in its tracks. Then, slowly it turned its head and looked directly at my tree stand. The face. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The eyes were dark, intelligent. There was awareness there, recognition. It knew I was there, and it wanted me to know that it knew. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10, 15 seconds. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My rifle might as well have been a toy for all the good it did me. I never even thought about raising it. Then it made this sound. Not a growl or a roar, but this low, rumbling vocalization that I felt in my chest more than heard. The closest thing I can compare it to is when a semi-truck drives by and you feel that deep vibration, but this was organic, alive. Without any apparent hurry, it turned and walked into the thick understory. The brush was dense there, stuff I'd have to fight through, but it moved through it like it was nothing. Within seconds, it was gone, taking the deer with it. I stayed in my stand for another 2 hours, completely frozen. I couldn't make myself climb down. When I finally did, my legs were so shaky I nearly fell. I practically ran back to my truck, breaking every rule of stealth I've ever learned about moving through the woods. The next day, I went back with my brother-in-law. I had to know I wasn't crazy. We found the tracks. They were huge, 18 inches long and deeply impressed in the soft ground. The stride length was over 5 feet. We followed them for about a quarter mile before they disappeared into rocky ground. We also found where it had been feeding on the deer. The carcass was mostly gone, but what was left? The way it had been torn apart wasn't like any predator I know. The bones weren't crushed like a bear would do. They were almost surgically clean, like something with opposing thumbs had methodically stripped them. I haven't been back to that specific spot since then. I still hunt other parts of the property, but something changed in me that day. The woods don't feel the same anymore. I know there's something out there that shouldn't exist, something that watches and thinks and knows we're here. I've heard other stories since then, whispered accounts from other hunters and locals about similar experiences in the area. Most people won't talk about it openly. You get labeled as crazy pretty quick around here if you do. But every now and then, someone will pull me aside at the gas station or the diner, and they'll start telling me about something they saw in the woods, always prefacing it with, "You're gonna think I'm nuts, but..." I've looked into other sightings in Missouri, especially around the Ozarks. There's a pattern there if you look for it. The details are always similar, the height, the way it moves, that feeling of being watched. But until you see it yourself, until you lock eyes with something that your brain tells you can't possibly exist, you can't really understand. I still have nightmares about those eyes, not because they were monstrous or angry, but because they were too knowing, too aware. Whatever I saw that day, it wasn't just some animal. It was something else entirely, something that chose to let me see it. The scratch marks we found on trees in the area afterward were 8 feet up, made by something reaching up, not stretching down like a bear would. The spacing of the marks matched human fingers, just scaled up to impossible size. I've got photos of everything, the tracks, the marks, even the deer carcass, but they don't do justice to what I experienced. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story 3 years ago, I'd have thought they were lying or crazy. Sometimes I still wake up and try to convince myself it was just a weird dream, or that I somehow misinterpreted what I saw. But then I remember that smell, that sound, and those eyes, and I know what I saw was real. The woods hold secrets, big ones, and sometimes, if you're unlucky enough, those secrets look right back at you. Story 12. It was October 12th, 2017. I remember the date clearly because I was tracking the migration patterns of the endangered Kirtland's warbler, which typically moves through the UP around that time. I'd gotten reports of some unusual bird calls in the Copper Harbor area, so I decided to set up my equipment and do some night recording. The weather that night was unusually warm for October, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze and partial cloud cover. I was about 4 miles northeast of Copper Harbor, in a dense section of old-growth forest near Lake Superior. My recording spot was roughly half a mile off US 41, deep enough in the woods that I couldn't hear any traffic noise. I had my usual gear, my Sony PCM D100 recorder with stereo microphones, a parabolic reflector for distant sounds, a thermal scope, which I used to spot birds in the dark, and my backpack with basic supplies. I started setting up around 7:30 p.m., just as dusk was settling in. The forest was alive with typical evening sounds, crickets, the occasional rustle of small animals, and the distant call of a barred owl. Nothing unusual. I had positioned myself near a small clearing, with good sight lines in all directions, though visibility was limited to about 40 feet due to the dense forest and fading light. The first sign that something was off came around 9:15 p.m. I was checking my recording levels when I noticed the crickets had gone completely silent. If you spend enough time in the woods, you know this usually means a predator is nearby. I initially thought it might be a coyote or maybe a bear, both common in the area, but something felt different. The silence was absolute, oppressive even. My years of experience had taught me to trust my instincts, and every fiber of my being was telling me something was wrong. Then came the smell. Anyone who works outdoors knows animal smells: bear, deer, skunk, but this was different. It was a heavy, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation and something else I couldn't identify. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I switched on my thermal scope and started slowly scanning the tree line. The rational part of my brain was still trying to categorize this as a normal wildlife encounter, but my hands were shaking as I moved the scope from tree to tree. That's when I heard the first vocalization. It started as a low, guttural sound, almost like a deep moaning. My recorder was running, and the VU meters were jumping into the red, indicating how powerful the sound was. The moan gradually transformed into something higher-pitched, ending in what I can only describe as a scream, but not like any animal scream I've ever heard, and I've heard plenty of foxes, cougars, and bears. This was different. It had an almost human quality to it, but at a pitch and volume that no human could produce. I froze. The sound had come from somewhere to my left, maybe 100 yards away. As I turned the thermal scope in that direction, I saw movement. Something massive was moving through the trees. In the thermal image, I could see it was giving off significant heat, indicating it was a large, warm-blooded creature. I'm used to identifying animals by their thermal signatures, but this was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The heat signature suggested something at least 8 feet tall, moving upright. As I watched through the scope, it moved between 2 large trees, and that's when I heard the sound of breaking wood. These weren't small branches. They were thick limbs, the kind that would take significant force to snap. The creature was either pushing them aside or deliberately breaking them, I couldn't tell which, but the casual way it handled these massive branches sent chills down my spine. I wanted to run, but I was paralyzed. Years of scientific training kicked in, and I found myself mentally cataloging details even as my heart was pounding out of my chest. The creature's movement was smooth, deliberate. Not like a bear's lumbering gait or a deer's nervous steps. It moved with purpose, and worse, it seemed to be moving in my direction. Through my scope, I could now see it more clearly. The thermal signature showed a massive bipedal form. The head sat directly on broad shoulders, no visible neck. The arms were extraordinarily long, reaching almost to what appeared to be knees. As it moved, I could see muscles shifting under what looked like thick hair or fur. Then it stopped. Even through the thermal scope, I could tell it was looking directly at me. My scientific mindset completely evaporated. Pure primal fear took over. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrifyingly out of my depth. The creature let out another one of those moaning screams, and this time it was so loud I had to fight the urge to cover my ears. My recording equipment was still running, capturing everything. What happened next still gives me nightmares. The creature took 3 massive steps forward, covering an impossible amount of ground. In the thermal scope, I could now make out more detail than I ever wanted to see. Its face was flat, almost human-like in its features, but larger and with a pronounced brow ridge. I could see the heat from its breath in the cool air. I don't remember making the conscious decision to run. One moment I was rooted to the spot. The next I was sprinting through the woods, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I crashed through the underbrush. I left most of my equipment behind, thousands of dollars worth of gear, but I managed to keep hold of my recorder and thermal scope. Behind me, I could hear movement, breaking branches, heavy footfalls, and that terrible screaming. The creature was following me, but it wasn't running. It was walking, almost casually, as if it knew it could catch me at any time. That was almost worse than if it had been chasing me at full speed. I ran until my lungs were burning. When I finally broke through the tree line onto US 41, I was covered in scratches from branches, and my clothes were soaked with sweat despite the cool night air. The sounds had stopped, but I didn't stop running until I reached my car. The next morning, after a sleepless night in a local motel, I went back with 2 local police officers to retrieve my equipment. Everything was exactly where I'd left it, undisturbed. But in the daylight, we found evidence that made my blood run cold. There were footprints, massive ones, at least 16 inches long and 8 inches wide. Several trees had broken branches, some as thick as my arm, at heights of 7, 8 feet off the ground. And most disturbing of all, we found hair samples caught on some of the broken branches. I still have the audio recordings and thermal footage from that night. The police report is on file at the Copper Harbor Station. I submitted the hair samples to a lab, but never heard back about the results. The whole incident left me with more questions than answers, and I haven't gone back to that part of the forest since. I know how this story sounds. Before that night, I would have been the first person to dismiss accounts like this. I'm a scientist. I deal in facts, evidence, and rational explanations. But what I encountered that night defied rational explanation. Whatever was out there in those woods was real. It was intelligent, and it fundamentally changed my understanding of what's possible in our world. I still do field research, but never alone anymore, and never at night in that area. Sometimes when I'm reviewing bird calls in my recordings, I'll come across that audio from that night, and those screams still make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was I encountered that night in Copper Harbor, it's still out there, and I can't help but wonder if it's watching and waiting for the next person who ventures too deep into those woods after dark. Story 13. It was September 14th, around 7:30 a.m., when we met up at our usual spot, the Shell station off Highway 515. There were 4 of us: me, Mike, my riding partner of 10 years, his brother Tom, and Chris, who'd recently joined our weekend rides. We'd planned to explore some of the more remote trails in the Chattahoochee National Forest, about 12 miles northeast of Blue Ridge. The weather was perfect that morning, clear skies, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with a slight breeze. We'd packed our usual gear: water, trail mix, basic tools, and our GoPros, though I still kick myself because mine died early into the ride. We were riding our dual sports. I was on my Kawasaki KLR 650, perfect for the mix of road and trail riding we had planned. The first couple of hours were normal. We took Highway 515 north before turning onto Forest Service Road 58, then branched off onto one of the lesser-used trails. It was around 10:15 a.m. when things started getting weird. We were about 8 miles into the forest, well off the main roads, when Mike signaled for us to stop. At first, I thought he'd spotted a deer, or maybe a bear, not uncommon in these parts. But when we killed our engines, he pointed to something that made no sense. About 30 yards off the trail, there was a group of young trees, each about 4-5 inches thick, bent over in perfect arches. And I don't mean bent like they'd grown that way or been pushed down by snow. These trees were literally folded over, creating perfect upside-down U-shapes with their tops pushed into the ground. The weird part? None of them were broken. These were green, living trees bent in ways that should have snapped them. I've been in construction for 20 years, and I know what it takes to bend wood. These trees would have required enormous force to bend like that, and they should have splintered. But they were intact, just bent. We counted 8 of them in a rough semicircle pattern. Chris wanted to take a closer look, so we parked our bikes and walked over. The ground around the trees was oddly clear of debris, almost like something had swept it clean. That's when we noticed the smell. This heavy, musty odor like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was distinctive enough that we all commented on it. Tom was taking pictures with his phone when we heard it. A loud, deliberate knock on wood, like someone hitting a tree with a baseball bat. It came from maybe 100 yards to our left. Before anyone could say anything, another knock answered from the opposite direction. Then another, from somewhere behind us. The knocks had this rhythm to them, almost like they were communicating. The forest had gone dead silent. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. Just those knocks echoing through the trees. I've spent enough time in the woods to know when something's not right, and every instinct was screaming at me to leave. That's when Chris pointed to something moving among the trees about 75 yards away. At first I thought it was just shadows, but then I saw it clearly. And I still struggle to describe what I saw. This thing was huge, at least 8 feet tall, moving bipedally between the trees. Its shoulders must have been twice as wide as mine, covered in dark brown or black hair. The way it moved, it wasn't like a bear or any animal I've ever seen. It was fluid, deliberate, almost human-like, but not quite. It crossed between 2 large oaks, and as it did, it literally pushed a dead tree out of its way. Not a sapling, but a proper dead tree that must have been 20 feet tall. The tree crashed through the forest with a sound that made us all jump. The creature disappeared into the thicker forest, but we could hear branches snapping and wood cracking in its wake. Mike whispered, "We need to go, now." None of us argued. We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the forest. The knocking had stopped, but that oppressive silence remained. When we got back to our bikes, we didn't waste any time. The engines roaring to life seemed obscenely loud in that quiet forest. As we pulled away, I glanced back and saw something that still haunts me. About where we'd been standing, there was movement in the canopy of a tall oak tree. Not like wind, but like something massive was pushing through the upper branches. The whole top of the tree was swaying, while the others around it remained still in the windless air. We rode out of there as fast as we safely could. None of us spoke until we got back to the main road. When we finally stopped at a gas station about 20 miles away, we tried to process what we'd seen. Tom had managed to take some pictures of the bent trees, but in typical fashion, they don't do justice to how strange and deliberate those formations looked in person. Most of his other photos were too blurry to make out anything clearly, just vague dark shapes among the trees that could be explained away as shadows. The whole encounter lasted maybe 15 minutes, but it felt like hours. We reported it to the local ranger station, but you can imagine how that went. They logged it as a possible bear sighting and unusual vandalism. We went back 2 days later with a larger group in the middle of the day. The bent trees were still there, but everything else was gone. No tracks. The ground was too hard and leaf-covered anyway. No broken branches where we'd seen the creature pass. Just those impossibly bent trees as evidence that something had been there. I've been back to those woods many times since then. It's still my favorite riding area, but never alone, and never that deep into that particular section. Sometimes, especially on quiet days, I'll hear knocking in the distance. It's probably just woodpeckers or falling branches, but I don't stick around to find out. I know how this story sounds. If someone had told me this 4 years ago, I would have thought they were full of it, or had drunk too much the night before. I've run through every possible explanation in my head. Bears, pranksters, some kind of natural phenomenon. None of them fit what we experienced. 4 grown men, all experienced outdoorsmen, all saw the same thing. The bent trees, the knocking, the creature itself. It was all too deliberate, too coordinated to be anything natural that I'm familiar with. The weirdest part? About a month later, I ran into an old-timer at the local hardware store who'd worked Forest Service in the area for 40 years. When I mentioned where we'd been riding, he just nodded and said they used to call that area the Crooked Woods because of stories about bent trees and strange noises. He wouldn't elaborate, just shook his head and changed the subject. I still ride those trails almost every weekend, but something changed for me that day. The forest feels different now, like I'm just a visitor in something else's territory. I keep my GoPro charged these days, and I never ride alone anymore. Sometimes, especially in the early morning or late evening, I'll get that feeling of being watched. When that happens, I don't stop. I don't slow down. I just keep moving. I've never seen anything like what we encountered that day again, but I know it's out there. The knocking still echoes through those woods sometimes, and occasionally I'll come across young trees bent in impossible ways. I don't stop to investigate anymore. Some mysteries are better left alone. Story 14. I remember the date exactly because it was the harvest moon, and the fishing is usually excellent during a full moon. I'd been having a rough week at work, so I decided to do some night fishing at Churchill Lake, one of my favorite spots in the North Main woods. I've always preferred fishing at night. There's something peaceful about being out there alone, with just the sounds of nature and the gentle lapping of water against the boat. I launched my 14-foot aluminum boat around 8:30 p.m. The weather was perfect, unusually warm for September, probably in the mid-60s with barely any wind. The moon was so bright I hardly needed my headlamp. I headed to my usual spot, about half a mile from the boat launch, where the water's relatively shallow and there's a fallen tree that usually attracts some decent-sized bass. Everything was normal for the first couple of hours. I caught a few smallmouth bass, nothing spectacular, but I wasn't complaining. It must have been around 11:15 p.m. when things started feeling different. You know that feeling when the woods go completely silent, like someone hit a mute button on nature? That's exactly what happened. The frogs stopped croaking, no more splashing from fish jumping, just dead silence. At first I thought maybe a bear or a moose was nearby. That's usually what causes that kind of silence. I turned down my lantern and started scanning the shoreline, which was maybe 75 yards away. That's when I caught a whiff of something that made my stomach turn. It was this overwhelming stench, like a mix of wet dog, rotting meat, and something musky I can't even describe. I've smelled dead animals before, but this was different, more pungent, more alive. I was facing the eastern shore when I heard it. Water moving, but not like a fish jumping or a beaver swimming. This was bigger, more deliberate. I slowly turned around, and I swear my heart stopped for a second. There, in the moonlight, about 40 yards away, something was moving through the water. The lake is pretty shallow there, maybe 4-5 feet deep, and this thing was wading through it like it was nothing. The moonlight was hitting it perfectly, and I could see every detail with horrifying clarity. It was huge. I'm a contractor, so I'm pretty good at estimating measurements, and this thing had to be at least 8.5 feet tall. It was covered in dark, thick hair that looked almost black when wet, but had a reddish-brown tint where the moonlight hit it. The muscles on its arms and shoulders, Jesus, they were massive. It moved with this strange grace, like it knew exactly how to walk through water without making much noise. I've seen plenty of bears standing up in my life, but this wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, and its head sat directly on its shoulders, no visible neck. The head was shaped kind of like a cone, not round like a bear's, and it moved too smoothly, too upright to be anything I'd ever seen before. I sat there completely frozen, afraid to even breathe. My hand was gripping my fishing rod so tight my knuckles were white, but I didn't dare move to set it down. The creature was moving at an angle across the lake, heading toward the northern shore. It never looked in my direction, thank God, but I could see its profile clearly. The face, I only got a glimpse of it when it turned slightly, but it looked almost human-like, but flatter, with a pronounced brow ridge. The whole thing probably lasted less than 2 minutes, but it felt like hours. It moved with purpose, like it knew exactly where it was going. When it reached the other shore, it emerged from the water with the same eerie grace. Water cascaded off its body, and in the moonlight, I could see its wet fur matted against its frame, highlighting just how muscular this thing was. It disappeared into the tree line without making a sound, just melted into the darkness, like it was never there. I sat in my boat for what must have been another 30 minutes, not moving a muscle, barely breathing. The smell lingered for a while after it was gone. Eventually, some of the normal nighttime sounds started to return. A few frogs here and there, some distant owl calls. Only then did I dare to start my trolling motor, and I've never moved so slowly and quietly in my life. I was terrified of drawing attention to myself. When I finally got back to the boat launch, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely load my boat onto the trailer. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying it in my mind, trying to rationalize what I'd seen. I've heard stories about Bigfoot all my life. Everyone around here has. But I'd always written them off as tall tales or misidentified bears. Now, I don't know what to think. I went back the next day in the daylight, hoping to find tracks or some kind of evidence. The shoreline where it emerged was too rocky to hold footprints, and if there were any broken branches or signs of passage in the woods, I couldn't distinguish them from normal animal trails. Part of me was relieved. I didn't really want to find anything that would confirm what I'd seen. I've only told this story to my wife and my brother, and they both think I dozed off and had a vivid dream. But I know what I saw. I was wide awake, stone sober, and saw something that shouldn't exist wade across that lake like it was taking an evening stroll. I still fish that lake sometimes, but never at night anymore. And every time I'm out there, I can't help but scan the shoreline, wondering if it's out there, watching. The weird thing is, after doing some research later, I found out there have been other sightings in the Allagash region over the years, some eerily similar to mine, always near water, always at night. Makes me wonder how many other people are keeping quiet about what they've seen, afraid people will think they're crazy. I don't expect anyone to believe me, and honestly, I'm not sure I would believe it myself if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. All I know is that something crossed that lake that night. Something that shouldn't exist according to everything I thought I knew about the world. And now, every time I hear the woods go quiet, I wonder if it's nearby, moving through the forests of northern Maine, like it has been for who knows how long. Story 15. I never thought I'd be sharing this, but what happened to us in Pinecrest still keeps me up at night. My wife Sarah and I bought a cabin there in late 2019 as our weekend getaway spot. It's pretty isolated, about 2 miles from the nearest neighbor, surrounded by dense forest. We loved that seclusion at first. Now I'm not so sure. Everything started in January 2020. We just had a heavy snowfall, and I went to check on the cabin since we hadn't been there for a couple weeks. The moment I pulled up in my truck, something felt off. You know that feeling when things aren't quite how you left them? That's what hit me. I noticed them as soon as I got out. Footprints in the snow. Not deer, not bear. These were different. They were huge, about 18 inches long, and showed 5 distinct toes. At first I thought someone was playing a prank, but who would trek all the way out here just for that? The prints went all around the cabin, like whatever made them had been circling the place. They were deep too. Whatever left them had to be incredibly heavy. I took pictures and measurements, though my hands were shaking. 45 centimeters long. The stride length was massive, easily over 6 feet. I've been hunting in these woods for 20 years and never seen anything like this. The way the snow was compressed showed significant weight distribution. This wasn't someone with fake feet strapped to their boots. I called Sarah, and she drove up that afternoon. We decided to stay the night, thinking maybe we could catch whoever was messing with us. Big mistake. It started around 10 p.m. We were sitting in the living room when we heard it. Heavy footsteps on the roof. Not like a raccoon or a branch scraping. These were deliberate steps, slow and powerful enough to make the ceiling beams creak. Sarah grabbed my arm so tight it left marks. The footsteps moved from one end of the roof to the other, stopping occasionally. Then came the knocks. 3 distinct bangs on the wall, so powerful they made the windows rattle. My first thought was bears, but bears don't knock in patterns. These were purposeful. Knock, 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 pause. Then 3 more. I grabbed my rifle, but Sarah begged me not to go outside. The rational part of my brain kept saying there had to be a logical explanation, but every instinct was screaming that something was very wrong. We could hear heavy breathing outside, like something massive was right by our bedroom window. The dogs in the properties miles away were going crazy, howling like I'd never heard before. The smell hit us next. This overwhelming, musky, rotten odor that somehow got into the cabin despite all windows being closed. It was like wet dog mixed with decaying meat and something else I can't even describe. I've gutted deer and encountered plenty of dead animals in the woods, but this was different. This smell had a presence to it. Around midnight, the sounds changed. Whatever it was started dragging something heavy across the roof. The scratching was unbearable, like massive claws or hands scraping across the shingles. Then we heard what I can only describe as vocalizations, not quite human, not quite animal. A deep, resonating sound that started low and rose to something like a howl, but with this guttural quality that made my skin crawl. Sarah started crying, and I'm not ashamed to admit I was close to it myself. We huddled in the living room until dawn, listening to this thing pace around our cabin, occasionally hitting the walls or making those awful sounds. Sometimes it would go quiet for 30 minutes, and we'd think it was gone, only to hear a massive thud right above us. When the sun finally came up, everything went silent. I waited another hour before going outside, rifle ready. The new snow from overnight was covered in those same massive footprints, even clearer than before. They went right up to our windows. Whatever it was had been standing there, looking in at us. The prints led to the back of the property before disappearing into the tree line. But the worst part was what we found on the roof. Long strands of dark, coarse hair caught in the shingles, claw marks that had torn through the outer layer, and on the chimney, pressed into the metal cap, a massive handprint in the snow, clearly showing 5 fingers. We drove home that morning and didn't go back for 2 weeks. When we finally returned, the prints were gone, melted away with the snow. But we found broken branches 15 feet up on the trees surrounding the cabin. Something had snapped them, something tall enough to reach that high. This happened 4 more times over the next month, always after fresh snow, always at night. We installed security cameras, but they either malfunctioned or showed nothing but shadows. The last time in late February was the worst. The thing actually started pushing against our door, making the frame creak. We could see the wood flexing inward. I fired a warning shot through the window and everything went dead quiet. We heard something massive crashing through the trees, breaking branches as it fled. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. No more footprints, no more night visits. The spring thaw came and we never experienced anything like that again. We still own the cabin, still go there sometimes, but never in winter. Never when there's snow to show us what's walking around out there. I've researched everything I can about the area since then. Turns out there have been similar reports in Pinecrest going back decades, usually in winter, usually involving isolated properties. The local rangers won't talk about it. When I tried to file a report, they just took down the basics and said they'd look into it. Their faces said they'd heard it all before. I'm not claiming I know what was out there. I'm not putting a label on it. All I know is that something massive, something intelligent, something that walked on 2 legs spent a month terrorizing us in our own home. The footprints were real, the sounds were real, the fear was real. Sometimes when it snows here in the city, I still wake up at night, straining to hear footsteps on the roof. Sarah says she can still smell that awful odor in her dreams. We don't talk about it much anymore, but we both know what we experienced. There's something out there in the Pinecrest woods, something that gets bold when the snow falls, something that's smart enough to know when we're watching, strong enough to leave marks in solid wood, and patient enough to spend entire nights trying to find a way in. I'm sharing this because I need someone to know what happened. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar. Maybe someone has answers. All I know is that I'll never look at snowy footprints the same way again, and I'll never forget the sound of those knocks on my cabin wall. Story 16. I've been a farmer in Cedar Bluff, Mississippi my whole life, just like my father and his father before him. Never thought I'd be sharing something like this, but what happened on my farm in September 2018 still haunts me, and I need to get it off my chest. It started with the sheep. I run a mixed operation, mostly cattle, but I keep about 80 head of sheep too. That morning started like any other. I got up before sunrise around 5 a.m. to do my regular checks. The air was thick with humidity, typical Mississippi weather, when I headed out to the back pasture where I keep the sheep. I noticed something was off before I even got to the fence line. There was this heavy silence, no birds, no crickets, nothing. Anyone who's lived on a farm knows that's not natural, especially at dawn. As I got closer to the sheep pen, I picked up this smell. It's hard to describe, like a mix of wet dog and something rotting. At first I thought maybe a coyote had gotten to one of the sheep, but this was different, stronger, more pungent, the kind of smell that makes your stomach turn. Then I saw them, 3 of my ewes dead. But this wasn't like any predator attack I'd ever seen, and I've dealt with my share of coyotes and wild dogs. These sheep weren't eaten, they were just broken, like something had grabbed them and squeezed or thrown them. One had its back clearly snapped, another's neck was twisted at an impossible angle. The third was crumpled against the fence post, like it had been tossed there. No blood, no bite marks, just broken bodies. I've got security cameras set up around the property because we've had problems with thieves in the past. When I checked the footage later that morning, my hands were shaking so bad I could barely operate the computer. What I saw, I've played it back hundreds of times, trying to convince myself it was something else, anything else. The timestamp showed 2:47 a.m. At first everything looked normal, just the infrared view of my sheep sleeping in their pen. Then they all suddenly stood up, bunching together like they do when they're spooked. That's when this thing came into frame. The cameras mounted on a pole about 12 feet high, giving a good view of the whole pen. This creature, and I still don't know what else to call it, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. The way it moved, it was on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging almost to its knees, and it was covered in what looked like thick, dark fur. The camera caught it making this smooth leap over my fence, and these aren't low fences, they're 6.5 feet high to keep predators out. This thing cleared it like it was stepping over a garden hose. The sheep went crazy, running to the far corner, but they had nowhere to go. The way it moved through the pen, it was fast. Too fast for something that size. It would grab a sheep with one hand, and just, I can barely write this. It would squeeze or throw them like they were nothing more than stuffed toys. The whole thing lasted maybe 3 minutes. Then it just stopped, stood still for a moment, and turned its head directly toward the camera. I swear my heart nearly stopped when I saw its eyes reflect in the infrared light, 2 bright, intelligent-looking orbs. It seemed to stare right into the camera for a few seconds, then turned and leaped back over the fence, disappearing into the tree line behind my property. I called the sheriff's office, of course. Deputy Williams came out, took some pictures, wrote up a report. I could tell he didn't believe me, even when I showed him the footage. He suggested it might be someone in a costume, maybe kids pulling a prank. But I know what I saw. No person could move like that, could be that big, or have that kind of strength. I installed more cameras after that, higher-powered ones with better night vision. Put up additional security lights, too. For weeks, I sat up most nights with my rifle watching. The sheep were nervous for a long time, staying bunched up, not grazing properly. That smell lingered around the pen for days, even after I'd removed the dead ewes and cleaned everything. Sometimes at night, I still hear strange noises from the woods behind my property. Not like normal wildlife. These are different. Like wood knocking against wood, or this deep, rumbling sound that's almost too low to hear, but you can feel it in your chest. I've found broken branches high up in trees, way higher than any person could reach. And sometimes, early in the morning, I'll find these huge footprints in the soft ground near the tree line. They're always partial prints, never clear enough to make a cast, and they disappear into the harder ground. The thing is, I've heard stories from other farmers in the area since then. Nothing as direct as what I experienced, but similar things. Livestock acting strange, unexplained noises, that same horrible smell. Most people around here won't talk about it openly. You mention something like this, you get labeled as crazy or attention-seeking, but I know what I saw that night. That footage is still on my computer, though I can barely bring myself to watch it anymore. I've thought about selling the farm, moving somewhere else, but this land's been in my family for generations. Whatever that thing was, it hasn't come back to the sheep pen, at least not directly. Maybe it knows about the cameras now, or maybe it's just moved on to other areas. I don't know. What I do know is that there's something out there in the woods of Mississippi that science can't explain, something that's not supposed to exist. And some nights, when the moon is high and that unnatural silence falls over my farm, I can feel it watching from the darkness between the trees. I've never been a big believer in the paranormal or cryptids or any of that stuff. I'm just a simple farmer who spent his whole life dealing with practical, tangible things. But after what I saw that night, I know there are things in this world that defy explanation. I still work my farm every day, take care of my animals, and try to keep living normally. But I never go out at night without my rifle anymore, and I never turn my back to those woods. Some things, once you've seen them, you can't unsee. And some nights I still wake up in a cold sweat, remembering those glowing eyes staring into my camera, like it knew exactly what it was doing, like it wanted me to see it. Story 17. I'm an avid cross-country skier, and I've been doing it for about 15 years now. That day, I was out with my two friends, Mike and Sarah, who I've known since college. We'd planned this trip weeks in advance, watching the weather patterns and snow conditions. Red Lodge is beautiful in winter, and we'd found this remote trail that supposedly had amazing views of the Beartooth Mountains. We got an early start, heading out around 7 a.m. The temperature was hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 9 degrees Celsius, and there was about 2 feet of fresh powder from a storm that had blown through earlier that week. The sky was clear, and the forecast promised perfect conditions. We parked at this small, unmarked lot about 12 miles outside of town, where the ploughed road ends. There wasn't another car in sight. The first 2 hours were exactly what we'd hoped for. Pristine snow, complete silence except for the swish of our skis and those incredible mountain views. We were following a route I'd mapped out that would take us through this valley I'd read about on some skiing forums. It was more remote than our usual spots, but we're all experienced and had our emergency gear. Around 10:30 a.m., we stopped for a quick snack break. That's when Sarah noticed something odd about the snow ahead of us. At first, we thought maybe some other skiers had come through, but as we got closer, we realized these weren't ski tracks at all. They were footprints, massive footprints. I've been hiking and skiing in Montana for most of my life, and I've seen all kinds of animal tracks, bear prints, moose tracks, you name it. But these were different. They were perfectly spaced, about 5 feet apart, in an absolutely straight line across some pretty rough terrain. Each print was easily 16 inches long and incredibly deep, like whatever made them was carrying serious weight. Mike pulled out his phone to take pictures, while I knelt down to examine one of the prints. The detail was incredible. You could see what looked like toe impressions, and the way the snow was compressed suggested these were fresh, probably from early that morning. What really got to me was how they just went straight through everything, over fallen logs, through deep snowdrifts, places where we had to carefully navigate around obstacles. We followed the tracks for about 200 yards, all of us getting increasingly uneasy. The forest had gotten weirdly quiet. Usually you hear chickadees or nuthatches, maybe a squirrel, but there was nothing. Just this heavy silence that seemed to press in around us. That's when we heard it. I've heard elk bugle, bears roar, and all sorts of wildlife sounds, but this was something else entirely. It started as this low, guttural sound that quickly rose into this incredibly powerful scream that echoed through the entire valley. It was so loud it seemed to vibrate in my chest. Sarah dropped her water bottle, and I felt every hair on my body stand up. The scream lasted maybe 5, 6 seconds, and in that time none of us moved or breathed. It seemed to come from the ridgeline about half a mile ahead of us, and it had this intelligence to it. It wasn't just an animal cry. It felt directed, purposeful. Then we heard the cracking of branches, loud ones, like something big was moving through the trees up on the ridge. We could track the sound moving parallel to our position. Whatever it was big enough to snap branches that we could hear from that distance. Mike whispered, "We need to go, now." None of us argued. We turned around and started skiing back the way we came, moving as fast as we safely could. Every few minutes we'd hear more branch snapping, always keeping pace with us, but staying up on that ridge. The sound would stop when we stopped, almost like it was watching us. About halfway back to our car, we heard it again, that same horrifying scream, but this time it was answered by another one from somewhere behind us. That's when true panic set in. I'm not ashamed to admit that we abandoned any pretense of careful skiing and just bombed it back toward the parking lot as fast as we could manage. The last quarter mile, everything went dead silent again. No breaking branches, no screams, nothing. Just the sound of our own labored breathing and skis on snow. When we finally reached the car, we threw our gear in and got out of there so fast we were still in our ski pants. We didn't talk much on the drive back to town. What could we say? We'd all experienced the same thing, but none of us wanted to be the first to put it into words. When we finally stopped at a diner in Red Lodge, we pulled up Mike's photos. They were all there, clear shots of those huge prints, with Sarah's ski pole laid across one for scale. Looking at them in the safety of the diner, they seemed even more impossible. I've spent countless hours since then trying to rationalize what happened. I've researched every large animal in Montana, looked up weather phenomena that could explain the sounds, tried to find any other explanation for those tracks. But I keep coming back to the intelligence of it all. The way whatever it was seemed to pace us, the way it stopped when we stopped, how those prints went in that perfectly straight line through terrain that would have forced any normal animal to detour. We haven't been back to that specific trail, though I still ski other areas around Red Lodge. Sometimes when I'm out there I catch myself scanning the ridgelines, straining to hear anything unusual over the sound of my skis. The locals I've talked to just kind of nod when I mention where we were that day. Turns out there's been other stories from that valley over the years, though most people don't like to talk about them. I still have Mike's photos on my phone. Sometimes I look at them late at night, measuring the prints against the ski pole, trying to convince myself there's some normal explanation. But deep down, I know what we experienced that day was real. Something intelligent was out there in those mountains, something that wanted us to know we were in its territory. I'm not saying it was Bigfoot. I'm just saying that after that day, I understand why people believe. And I understand why so many of these stories end with people getting out of there instead of trying to get a closer look. When you're actually out there, when you feel that presence and hear those sounds, every instinct you have screams at you to leave. I just count myself lucky that whatever it was seemed content to just warn us away. The footprints we found that day measured exactly 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The stride length was consistently 5 feet 4 inches. The depth of the prints in that powder snow was nearly 6 inches. It would have taken something weighing at least 800 pounds to sink that deep in those conditions. These aren't estimates or guesses. They're measurements from the photos we took, photos I still have but honestly don't like looking at anymore. Sometimes I think about going back there with better camera equipment, maybe in a larger group. But then I remember that sound, that deep, powerful scream that felt like it was shaking the mountains themselves, and I decide some mysteries are better left unexplored. Whatever's out there in those remote valleys of Montana, it made it very clear that it wants to be left alone. I plan to respect that wish. Story 18. I need to get this off my chest. I've been a forest ranger in the Lincoln National Forest for over 12 years, and what I experienced last October has completely changed how I view our wilderness. I've always been the skeptical type. I've dealt with my fair share of mountain lion sightings, bear encounters, and even the occasional lost hiker spinning wild tales. But this was different. It was October 15th, 2019, just another Tuesday on patrol. I was checking some of the more remote areas in the Sacramento Mountains near Cloudcroft, New Mexico. The weather was unusually mild for October, around 65 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze and partial cloud cover. I remember these details vividly because I wrote them in my daily log, something we're required to do for every patrol. I'd taken my truck as far as I could up Forest Service Road 164, then started hiking into one of our least visited sections, about 8 miles from the nearest frequently used campground. It was around 2:30 p.m. when I noticed something odd. I've been through this area hundreds of times over the years, but something caught my eye that I'd never seen before. Off to my left, maybe 50 yards into a dense cluster of ponderosa pines, there was this structure. Not your typical hunter's blind or makeshift campsite. This was different. It was a massive configuration of branches and logs, intricately woven together in a way that couldn't have happened naturally. Some of these branches were thick, easily 4-5 inches in diameter, and they were twisted and interlinked in ways that defied normal forest debris patterns. As a ranger, part of my job is documenting unusual structures or changes in the forest, so I pulled out my Canon DSLR, we use them for official documentation, and started taking photos. The structure was roughly dome-shaped, probably 8 feet tall at its highest point, with an opening that faced northeast. What really struck me was the precision. These weren't just fallen branches piled up. They were deliberately placed and woven together, some even showing signs of being stripped of their bark. That's when I first noticed the smell. Anyone who works in forests knows their smells: wet leaves, pine sap, occasionally rotting vegetation. This was different. It was a heavy, musky odor, similar to wet dog, but much more pungent, with an almost sour undertone, strong enough to make my nose wrinkle, but not overwhelming. I was taking close-up shots of how the branches were interconnected when the forest went quiet. If you spend enough time in the wilderness, you know that sudden silence usually means something's wrong. No bird calls, no squirrels chittering, nothing. Just that eerie stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. My first thought was mountain lion. They're known to trigger this kind of response from other wildlife. I pulled my bear spray from my belt, standard equipment for us, and did a slow 360-degree scan of my surroundings. That's when I heard it. A deep crack of a branch breaking, coming from about 40 yards behind me. The sound came from an area of particularly dense underbrush. I raised my camera, more out of habit than anything else. We're trained to document everything. Through the viewfinder, I could see movement in the vegetation. Something was pushing the branches aside, something big. What happened next still gives me chills. As I zoomed in, adjusting my focus, a face emerged from between the branches. Not a bear face, not any kind of face I'd ever seen in all my years as a ranger. It was almost human, but not quite. Much larger, with a pronounced brow ridge and deep-set eyes that looked intelligent. The face was dark, covered in what appeared to be black or dark brown hair, but the skin around the eyes was lighter, almost grayish. I managed to snap exactly 3 photos before my hands started shaking too badly to hold the camera steady. The creature was massive. I'm good at estimating heights after years of measuring trees, and based on its position relative to the surrounding pines, it had to be at least 8 feet tall. Its shoulders were incredibly broad, easily twice the width of mine, and I'm not a small guy. What really got to me wasn't its size, though. It was how it moved. There was nothing animal-like about its movements. It was deliberate, almost careful. The way it positioned itself to observe me through the branches. And those eyes. They weren't just looking at me. They were studying me. My training kicked in, and I started backing away slowly, keeping my eyes on the creature while trying to maintain what we call a non-threatening posture. That's when it made a sound that I'll never forget. Not a growl or a roar, but this deep, resonant vocalization that seemed to start in its chest. It was almost like a whale song, but deeper, with this weird modulation that made my chest vibrate. I kept backing up until I was about 60 yards from the structure. The creature hadn't moved from its position, but I could feel it watching me. Then something even stranger happened. It reached out and deliberately broke a branch, snapping it with what seemed like minimal effort. The crack echoed through the forest like a gunshot. That's when my nerve broke. I turned and started walking quickly back toward my truck, fighting every instinct to run. We're trained never to run from predators, but in that moment, every cell in my body was screaming at me to sprint. I maintained my pace, but I could hear movement in the forest parallel to my path. Breaking branches, the sound of something large moving through the undergrowth. The sounds followed me for about half a mile, always staying just out of clear sight. Then they stopped as abruptly as they had begun. The regular forest sounds gradually returned. First a single bird call, then more, until the normal symphony of forest life resumed. I made it back to my truck and sat there for a good 20 minutes, hands shaking as I tried to write up my incident report. I knew how it would sound. I'd read enough Bigfoot sighting reports over the years to know exactly how crazy this would seem. I ended up writing it up as an unusual structure discovery with signs of large wildlife activity. When I got home that night, I immediately downloaded the photos from my camera. The first 2 shots of the face were blurry, typical camera shake, but the third one, it was clearer. Not National Geographic quality, but clear enough to show what I'd seen. I submitted it with my report, but I never heard anything back about it. When I checked the system a week later, the incident had been logged simply as unusual forest structure discovered, possible illegal camping activity. Here's the thing. I've been back to that spot 4 times since then. The structure is still there, but it's different each time, like someone or something is maintaining it, adding new branches, reinforcing weak spots. The smell comes and goes. Sometimes I hear those branches breaking in the distance, but I've never seen the creature again. I know how this sounds. If someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have nodded politely while mentally cataloguing all the logical explanations. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know that there's something out there in the Sacramento Mountains that defies explanation. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. I'm still trying to process it myself. But I can say this with absolute certainty. Whatever I encountered that day wasn't any known species I've encountered in my 12 years of forest service. And the way it looked at me, that wasn't just an animal looking at a threat or prey. That was something else entirely. The whole experience has changed how I do my job. I still patrol that area. I have to. It's part of my route. But I'm more cautious now. I pay more attention to unusual structures. I notice when the forest goes quiet. And sometimes, when I'm deep in the backcountry and that musky smell drifts by on the breeze, I know I'm not alone out there. What bothers me most isn't the encounter itself. It's the implications. If these creatures are out there, and after what I saw, I'm convinced they are, how have they remained hidden for so long? How many of those dismissed reports over the years were actually true? And most importantly, what else don't we know about our forests? I still have the photos, stored safely on multiple hard drives. I look at them sometimes, usually late at night when I'm trying to convince myself that what I saw that day was something else, something explainable. But every time I look at that third photo, I know what I saw. Those eyes looking back at me through the viewfinder, they knew what they were looking at too. Story 19. It was late October 2020. My team and I were exploring a remote cave system about 12 miles outside of Marlinton. There were 4 of us: me, Jake, our geology expert, Sarah, who specializes in cave photography, and Mike, our most experienced climber. We'd heard about this particular cave system from local cavers, but it wasn't well documented. That's exactly the kind of thing we live for. The morning started normally enough. We arrived at the cave entrance around 7:30 a.m. The weather was cool, maybe mid-40s with a light drizzle, typical fall weather in West Virginia. The cave entrance was tucked away in a heavily forested area, requiring about a 2-hour hike from where we had to leave our vehicles. Everything seemed routine during our initial safety checks. We had our primary lights, backup lights, first aid supplies, enough water and energy bars for 12 hours, and our mapping equipment. Our plan was to explore and document the main passage and any significant side tunnels we might find. The first hour was textbook caving, mapping the entrance chamber and taking initial measurements. The cave started with a relatively wide opening that narrowed into a traditional tunnel system. The limestone formations were beautiful, and Sarah was getting some great shots for our documentation. Around 10 a.m., about 800 feet into the cave system, Mike noticed something odd. There were these footprints in the soft clay of the cave floor. At first we thought they might be from previous explorers, but they were huge, at least 16 inches long and incredibly deep, suggesting whatever made them was extremely heavy. They weren't old either. The edges were still fairly sharp. Jake took measurements and photos for scale. What really got to us was that these prints didn't follow any logical pattern like human explorers would use. They meandered randomly, sometimes disappearing into tiny side passages that seemed way too small for whatever made those prints. Then we found the scratch marks. They were about shoulder height on the cave walls, deep gouges in the limestone. 4 parallel lines, each about 1 inch deep and 6, 8 inches long. We've seen bear marks before, but these were different, higher up, deeper, and the spacing between the marks was all wrong for a bear. That's when the cave started feeling different. You know that feeling when you're alone in your house at night, and suddenly you're absolutely certain someone else is there. It was like that, but 100 times worse because we were already 1,000 feet underground. The air changed too. There was this smell. If you've ever been caving, you know caves have their own smell, kind of damp, mineral-rich, earthy. But this was different. It was thick, musty, almost like wet dog mixed with something rotting. It wasn't overwhelming, just persistent enough to make us constantly aware of it. We pressed on, though every instinct was screaming at us to turn back. About 1,500 feet in, we reached a larger chamber. Our lights barely reached the ceiling, maybe 30 feet up. That's when we first heard it, a deep, rhythmic sound echoing through the chamber. At first we tried to rationalize it as water dripping or wind, but it was too regular, too deep. It sounded like breathing. Sarah was setting up her camera to photograph the chamber when Mike suddenly grabbed my arm. He was pointing his light at a side tunnel about 20 feet up the chamber wall. I'll never forget what I saw. Two eyes reflecting our light, set apart much wider than any animal I've ever seen. They were an odd yellowish-green color, and they were fixed right on us. The breathing sound stopped. For what felt like forever, we all just stood there frozen. Those eyes didn't move, didn't blink. They just watched. Then we heard it. A low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. It wasn't quite a growl, wasn't quite a purr, but it made every hair on my body stand up. Mike whispered, "Go," so quietly I barely heard it. We started backing up slowly, never taking our lights off those eyes. That's when whatever it was moved. We didn't see the full creature, thank God, but we saw the eyes shift, and there was movement in the darkness behind them. The sound of stone scraping against stone echoed through the chamber. I'd love to say we maintained our professional composure, but that would be a lie. We ran. We ran as fast as you can run in a cave while trying not to kill yourself on the rocks. The whole way back, we could hear something moving in the tunnels around us, not directly behind us, but parallel to us, as if it knew the cave system and was taking different routes. The sounds were always just at the edge of our hearing, rocks shifting, that weird rumbling sound, and what sounded like heavy feet on stone. A few times we heard that sound echo from passages ahead of us, as if it was trying to cut us off, forcing us to take different routes back to the entrance. We made it out in record time. The sunlight had never looked so good. We didn't stop running until we reached our base camp. All our professional equipment, the mapping gear, Sarah's main camera, Jake's geological sampling tools, we left them all in there. Nobody wanted to spend one more second in that cave than we had to. When we finally caught our breath and checked the time, only about 4 hours had passed since we entered the cave. It felt like days. We broke down our base camp in silence and hiked back to our vehicles. The whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the tree line. We filed a report with the local caving association, but we kept it vague. How do you tell other professionals that you ran from a cave because you saw eyes in the dark? We mentioned the footprints and scratch marks, but attributed them to unknown wildlife activity. Looking back, I still can't explain what we encountered. The rational part of my brain tries to piece together explanations. Bears, mountain lions, some kind of cave adaptation that made normal wildlife seem strange. But none of that explains the size of those prints, the height of those scratch marks, or those eyes, those unnaturally wide-set eyes. I've been in hundreds of caves across the country. I've encountered bears, mountain lions, and all sorts of wildlife. This was different. There was an intelligence in those eyes that still haunts me. They weren't just watching us, they were studying us. I haven't been back to Marlinton since then. Sarah stopped cave photography altogether. Mike still explores, but never in West Virginia. Jake threw himself into researching local folklore about the caves in that region, but he won't talk about what he's found. Sometimes I pull up the few photos we managed to save on our phones, mostly just the footprints and some of the scratch marks. They're not great quality, the lighting was poor, and our hands were shaking. But they're enough to remind me that I'm not crazy, that something was in there with us that day. I still cave, but never alone anymore, and never without researching the hell out of the area first. And if I ever catch that distinctive smell again, or hear that deep rhythmic breathing, I'm out of there, no questions asked. What keeps me up at night isn't just the memory of what happened. It's the knowledge that whatever was in that cave is probably still there, waiting in the darkness, watching with those eyes for the next group of explorers who venture too deep into its territory. Story 20. I've been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, but what I captured on my camera in Whitefish, Montana last year still haunts me. I'm finally sharing this because I need to get it off my chest, and maybe someone else has seen something similar. It was October 12th, 2021. I'd been planning this shoot for weeks, wanting to capture the perfect sunrise sequence over the Whitefish mountain range. As a professional photographer specializing in landscape photography, I'd scouted the location multiple times to find the ideal spot. I settled on a clearing about 7 miles north of Whitefish, just off the Hidden Lake Forest Service Road. It's a relatively remote area, but I knew it would give me the perfect vantage point of the mountains. I arrived at the location around 4:30 a.m. The air was crisp, probably around 35 degrees Fahrenheit, and there was a light fog hanging low over the ground. I remember checking the weather forecast obsessively the night before. Clear skies were predicted, perfect for what I had planned. I parked my truck about a quarter-mile from my chosen spot and hiked in with my gear. My Canon EOS R5, 3 different lenses, a sturdy tripod, and my time-lapse equipment. I also brought my usual camping gear, a small tent, sleeping bag, some food, and water. I always over-prepare when I'm shooting in remote locations. The spot I'd chosen was a natural clearing that gave me an unobstructed view of the mountain range. There were tall pines surrounding the clearing, and the ground was covered in frost-covered grass and small bushes. I set up my equipment methodically, just like I'd done hundreds of times before. The time-lapse setup was pretty straightforward. I mounted the camera on my heavy-duty Really Right Stuff tripod, connected the intervalometer, and set it to take one shot every 20 seconds. I wanted to capture the transition from the pre-dawn darkness through the sunrise and into early morning. Everything was normal at first. I set up my small tent about 50 feet behind my camera setup, made some coffee on my portable stove, and settled in to wait for the sunrise. The clearing was silent, except for the occasional click of my camera's shutter. That's when I first noticed something was off. Around 5:15 a.m., I realized I couldn't hear any of the usual forest sounds. No early morning birds, no rustling of small animals, nothing. At first I didn't think much of it. Working in nature, you get used to these quiet moments, but this silence felt different. It felt heavy, almost oppressive. I remember checking my phone's temperature app. It had dropped to 32 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fog was getting thicker. I was sitting in my camping chair, sipping coffee, when I got that feeling. You know the one, like you're being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I felt my stomach tighten. I've been in the wilderness enough times to trust these instincts. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly scanned the tree line. The beam barely penetrated the fog, which had gotten surprisingly dense. That's when I smelled it. I've been around plenty of wild animals, but this smell was different. It was a powerful, musty odor, like wet dog mixed with rotting vegetation. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I remember thinking it was strange how suddenly it appeared. One moment nothing, the next it was overwhelming. I heard it before I saw it, a sound that I still can't properly describe. It was like heavy footsteps, but too spaced out for a normal animal. The sound seemed to be coming from the tree line to my left, moving parallel to the clearing. Whatever it was big. I could hear branches breaking under its weight. My first instinct was to grab my camera, but then I remembered the time-lapse was still running. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps continued, getting closer to the edge of the clearing. Then I heard what I can only describe as a deep, resonant breath. Not quite a growl, but deeper than anything I've heard before. Through the fog, I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape moving through the trees, but as it emerged into the clearing, I could make out more details. The figure was enormous. I'd estimate at least 8 feet tall. It walked upright, with a fluid, natural gait that was disturbingly human-like. The body was massive, covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. But it was the way it moved that really got to me. Deliberate, confident, like it owned the forest. I remained frozen in my chair, my coffee cup still in my hand, afraid that any movement would draw its attention. The creature crossed the clearing in what must have been 4 or 5 huge strides. Its head never turned toward me, but I'm certain it knew I was there. The way it moved, slightly angled away from my position, seemed too deliberate to be coincidental. As it reached the other side of the clearing, it disappeared into the fog and trees. The heavy footsteps gradually faded away, but I didn't move for what felt like hours. The sun was starting to lighten the sky when I finally gathered enough courage to check my camera. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely operate the camera's controls. I reviewed the sequence of shots, and there it was, frame after frame showing this massive figure moving through my composition. The images were dark and foggy, but you can clearly see a large bipedal figure crossing the frame. The sequence shows its fluid movement, its long arms, its massive shoulders. The proportions are all wrong for a bear or any other animal I know. I packed up my gear in record time, constantly looking over my shoulder. The smell lingered in the clearing, and I could see where the grass had been pressed down by its footsteps. The tracks were huge, easily 16 inches long, but the wet ground and frost made them indistinct. I practically ran back to my truck. As I was throwing my gear in the back, I heard it again, that deep, resonant sound, but this time it was more like a call or a howl. It came from much further up the mountain, but it still made me jump. I got in my truck and didn't stop until I reached Whitefish. I spent the next few days analyzing those photos. I've worked with wildlife photography for years. I know how to identify animals by their movement and shape. This was like nothing I've ever seen. The creature's stride length alone was impossible for a human. I calculated that it covered about 30 feet in just 4 steps. I've shown the photos to a few trusted colleagues, and their reactions have ranged from stunned silence to outright disbelief. One suggested I submit them to experts for analysis, but I'm hesitant. My reputation as a photographer is important to me, and I know how the photography community can be about potential Bigfoot photos. The thing that stays with me most isn't the photos or even the size of the creature. It's the deliberateness of the encounter. It felt like it wanted me to see it, wanted me to capture it on camera. The way it crossed directly through my frame, the timing with the fog and pre-dawn light, it all seems too perfect to be random. I've been back to that clearing several times since then, always during daylight hours and always with someone else. The area looks completely normal now, no unusual tracks, no strange smells, no inexplicable silence. But every time I'm there, I feel like I'm being watched. I've set up similar time-lapse shoots in the same spot, hoping to capture something again, but nothing unusual has appeared. I still don't know what to make of what I saw that morning. I've gone over every possible explanation: bears, moose, elk, but nothing matches what I captured. The fluid bipedal movement, the massive size, the deliberate behavior, it all points to something that shouldn't exist, but I know what I saw. The photos are still on my hard drive, and sometimes late at night, I find myself reviewing them again and again, trying to make sense of what crossed my path that October morning in Whitefish. One thing's for certain, I no longer do pre-dawn shoots alone in that area. Some things in nature aren't meant to be photographed, and sometimes being alone in the wilderness means being alone with something else. Story 21. It started about a week before the actual incident. We'd been hearing these weird sounds at night, not your typical owl hoots or coyote calls that we're all used to out here. I live on the outskirts of town, where the forest practically meets my backyard. At first, I didn't think much of it. Living this close to the wilderness, you get used to all sorts of animal sounds. But these were different, really different. They'd start around 10 p.m. most nights, deep, guttural vocalizations that seemed to echo through the trees. The closest thing I could compare it to would be a cross between a moose call and something more primal, but even that doesn't quite describe it. What really got to me was how these sounds seemed to communicate with each other. One would call from the north end of town, and a few seconds later, another would respond from the south. My neighbor Mike, who's been here even longer than me, started noticing his dogs acting weird. They'd usually bark at anything that moved, but when these sounds started, they'd just whimper and try to get inside. Even my cat, who's usually out hunting all night, started refusing to go outside after dark. The night it all went down, I was sitting on my back porch having a beer after work. It was unseasonably warm for September, about 65 degrees, with this weird fog rolling in from the mountains. The air felt heavy, like right before a storm. The streetlights were creating these eerie halos in the mist, and the forest behind my house was just a dark wall of shadows. Around 9:45 p.m., everything went quiet. And I mean everything. The crickets, the frogs in the creek behind my house, even the wind seemed to stop. That's when my motion sensor light clicked on. At first I thought it was probably a deer. We get them all the time. But then I caught this smell. God, that smell. Like wet dog mixed with rotting meat and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. I stood up, and that's when I heard it. Heavy footsteps, way too heavy for a deer, moving through my side yard. Whatever it was big enough to make the gravel crunch under its weight. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The motion light only covers part of the yard, creating this pocket of darkness between my house and the tree line. Then I saw it. Even now, months later, I get chills thinking about it. This massive shape emerged from the shadows. It had to be at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. The lighting wasn't great, but I could make out broad shoulders, long arms that hung down past its knees, and it was covered in dark, matted fur. The way it moved wasn't like any animal I've ever seen. It was fluid, almost human-like, but not quite. It stopped at the edge of the light, and I swear to God, it turned its head and looked right at me. I couldn't make out its face clearly, but I could see its eyes reflecting the porch light. They were dark, intelligent, and definitely aware of me. I couldn't move. It wasn't like in movies where people scream or run. I was literally frozen in place, my beer bottle halfway to my mouth, just staring at this thing. That's when another vocalization started from somewhere near the Wilsons' place, about half a mile away. The creature in my yard turned its head toward the sound and let out this response call that I felt in my chest. It was so loud and so deep that my windows actually rattled. I've been around bears, elk, and every other animal in these woods, but nothing has ever made a sound like that. The thing started moving again, heading toward the other call. It walked upright the whole time, its arms swaying slightly. As it moved through my yard, I could hear branches snapping under its feet. It must have weighed hundreds of pounds. When it reached the tree line, it melted into the darkness like it was never there. I sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to process what I'd just seen. My hands were shaking so bad I dropped my beer bottle. The crash of it breaking on my porch finally snapped me out of it, and I practically ran inside, locked every door and window, and stayed up all night with my shotgun across my lap. The next morning, I went out to check my yard. The grass where it had walked was completely flattened, creating a clear path from my side yard to the trees. There were footprints in the softer soil near my garden, huge prints, at least 16 inches long, with 5 distinct toes. I took pictures with my phone, but they came out blurry because my hands were still shaking. What really got to me were the trees at the edge of my property. 3 of them had these huge scratches about 8 feet up, fresh ones with the bark torn away. And there was hair caught in some of the rough bark, coarse, dark hair that didn't belong to any animal I know of. I called the local police, but they just filed it as a possible wildlife encounter. A few other people in town reported seeing something similar that night. Mrs. Johnson, who lives about 4 blocks over, said she saw it walk between her house and her neighbors, ducking to avoid the power lines. The Kim family, who run the convenience store, said they heard the vocalizations right outside their store and found their dumpster moved about 10 feet from its normal spot the next morning. For about a week after that we kept hearing the calls, but they were more distant, coming from deep in the forest. Then they just stopped, like whatever it was had moved on. Some folks in town tried to organize a search party to look for evidence, but nothing substantial was ever found, except for a few more unexplained footprints and broken branches. I still live in the same house, still work at the same mill, but I don't sit out on my porch at night anymore. I installed more motion lights and a security camera system, but I haven't caught anything unusual since that night. Sometimes, when the fog rolls in and the forest gets quiet, I catch myself straining to hear those calls again. Part of me hopes I never do, but another part of me knows what I saw was real. I know how this all sounds. If someone had told me this story 5 years ago, I probably wouldn't have believed them. But when you see something like that with your own eyes, when you hear those sounds and smell that smell, it changes you. There are things in these woods that we don't understand, things that defy explanation, and sometimes they get close enough to remind us of that fact. The weirdest part? None of my security cameras have ever caught anything unusual since I installed them. It's like whatever I saw that night knew exactly when to make itself known and when to disappear. I've spent countless hours trying to rationalize what I saw. Maybe it was a bear walking upright. Maybe it was some kind of mass hysteria affecting the whole town. But deep down, I know what I saw wasn't any known animal. The way it moved, the intelligence in its eyes, the deliberate way it responded to those calls. This was something else entirely. I still have the pictures of the footprints on my phone, though they're not great quality. I've shown them to a few wildlife experts who've come through town, But they all say the same thing. They've never seen prints quite like these. Too big for a bear, wrong shape for anything else they know of. One expert actually got really excited about them and wanted to organize a proper research expedition, but nothing ever came of it. These days, I keep a detailed journal of any unusual sounds or occurrences around my property. Maybe it's paranoid, but I want to be prepared if it ever comes back. I've installed infrared cameras, motion sensors, and even set up a small weather station to track atmospheric conditions. Because one thing I've noticed, on nights similar to that one, when the fog rolls in and the temperature hits that same sweet spot, I get this feeling in my gut, like something's watching, waiting. I don't expect everyone to believe my story. Hell, some days I have trouble believing it myself. But I know what I saw that night in Oak Ridge, and I know I'm not the only one who saw it. Whatever's out there in those woods, it's smart enough to stay hidden most of the time, but every now and then, for reasons we might never understand, it chooses to let itself be seen. Story 22. It was October 15th, 2022. Me, Jake, and Sarah had planned this hike for weeks. We're all part of a local hiking group in Asheville, and we'd done this particular trail maybe a dozen times before. The weather was perfect that morning, crisp fall air, around 55 degrees Fahrenheit, with a light breeze. We started early, hitting the trailhead off Highway 9 just as the sun was coming up, around 7:15 a.m. The first couple hours were completely normal. We were taking our time, stopping to photograph some of the fall colors. Jake's really into photography, so he had his fancy Canon DSLR, and I was just using my iPhone 13. Sarah was logging the hike on her Garmin watch like she always does. Everything changed around 10:30 a.m. We'd gone about 4.5 miles in, way off the main trail. We came across something that stopped us in our tracks. A cluster of trees, massive ones, just completely uprooted. I'm talking about 50, 60-foot tall trees that looked like they'd been yanked right out of the ground. At first, we thought maybe it was storm damage, but something felt wrong. The trees weren't broken or splintered like you'd see with wind damage. They were just pulled up, roots and all, like someone had picked them up and tossed them aside. Jake started taking pictures, and Sarah was trying to estimate the size of the largest tree. She later measured it at about 2 feet in diameter. I remember feeling really uneasy, but I couldn't explain why. The woods had gotten weirdly quiet. You know that sudden silence that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up? No birds, no squirrels, nothing. That's when we heard it. At first it sounded like someone dropping heavy logs, but it was rhythmic. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was moving, circling around us maybe 100 yards out. Then came the tree knocks, sharp, deliberate sounds like someone hitting a tree trunk with a baseball bat. 3 distinct knocks, pause, then 3 more. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold my phone. Jake had stopped taking pictures and was just standing there, completely frozen. Sarah whispered, "Guys," and pointed to our left, through a dense patch of mountain laurel. I'll never forget what I saw. Through the leaves, maybe 75 yards away, there was this figure. It was massive. I'm 6'2", and this thing had to be at least 8 feet tall. The way it moved wasn't like anything I've ever seen. It was partially hidden behind a large oak tree, but I could see dark, matted hair covering its body. The shoulders were impossibly broad, maybe twice the width of a large man. But it was the way it was watching us that really got to me. It wasn't like an animal observing potential prey. This thing was studying us, deliberately, intelligently. I could make out its face just enough to see eyes that looked almost reddish-brown in the filtered sunlight. The face was flat, more human-like than ape, but definitely not human. The smell hit us next. This overwhelming stench like rotting meat mixed with wet dog, and something else I can't even describe. It was so strong it made my eyes water. Sarah started gagging, and that seemed to trigger something. The creature shifted its weight, and the ground literally trembled. Then it let out this sound that I still hear in my nightmares. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like the lowest note on a pipe organ, but with this weird oscillation that made my chest vibrate. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. We didn't even discuss it, we just ran. All our training about what to do in wildlife encounters went right out the window. We sprinted back down the trail, stumbling over roots and rocks. I could hear heavy footsteps behind us, branches snapping, and this weird huffing sound that seemed to be getting closer. Then there was this crash so loud it sounded like a car wreck. A tree fell across the trail behind us. Not a small one, a full-sized oak. I glanced back just long enough to see the tree hitting the ground, and in that split second, I caught another glimpse of it. It was standing fully upright now, and Jesus Christ, it was big. Its head was above the lower branches of the surrounding trees. We ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes. We didn't stop until we hit the main trail junction, where there were other hikers. My Fitbit later showed my heart rate had peaked at 189 BPM. We were all hyperventilating, covered in sweat despite the cool weather. The rest of the hike back to our car was a blur. We kept hearing those knocks following us, always just far enough away that other hikers on the trail didn't seem to notice. The smell would hit us occasionally too, like whatever it was pacing us through the woods. When we finally got back to the parking lot, it was 1:45 p.m. Jake's camera had somehow malfunctioned. Every picture he took of the uprooted trees was completely black, even though the test shots he took at the beginning of the hike were fine. Sarah's Garmin data showed we'd covered almost 12 miles, including our panicked run, with some serious elevation changes. We reported it to the park rangers, but I could tell they didn't believe us. They suggested it might have been a bear, even though we all know bears don't knock on trees or stand upright at that height. They said they'd look into the uprooted trees, but we never heard back. I've been back to Black Mountain since then, but never on that particular trail. I've done enough research since then to know that there have been other sightings in the area over the years, but nothing quite like what we experienced. Jake sold his photography gear and hasn't been hiking since. Sarah still comes out with me sometimes, but she won't go anywhere without cell service now. The thing that really haunts me isn't just what we saw, it's the intelligence behind it. This wasn't just some animal. The way it herded us out of its territory, the deliberate tree knocks, the strategic positioning, it knew exactly what it was doing. Sometimes I wonder if we were ever really in danger, or if it was just letting us know we weren't welcome there. I've tried to rationalize it 1,000 different ways, but I know what we saw. The rangers never found those uprooted trees, or at least they say they didn't. But sometimes, when I'm hiking in the area and the woods go quiet, I catch that same smell on the wind, and I know it's still out there, watching. The worst part? Every time I drive past Black Mountain now, I catch myself scanning the tree line, and sometimes, especially in the early morning or late evening, I swear I can see something moving in there, something that doesn't quite fit, something that shouldn't exist, but does. I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I know how this sounds. Believe me, if someone had told me this story a year ago, I would have thought they were making it up. But I know what we experienced that day. And I know there are things in those mountains that we can't explain, things that don't want to be found. Story 23. It started in late September 2020. I had been working a promising site about 4 miles outside of Nederland, up in the hills where there used to be several historic mines. I'm not comfortable sharing the exact location. I still have active claims there. The spot is pretty remote, accessed by an old logging road that's barely maintained. I'd drive up in my beat-up 98 Tacoma and work from sunrise to sunset, living out of my truck during the week. The first strange incident happened on September 23rd. I arrived at my site early that morning, around 6 a.m., and immediately noticed something was off. My tools weren't where I'd left them the evening before. Now, I'm extremely meticulous about my equipment. It's expensive stuff, and I always lay everything out in a specific way before leaving. But that morning, my sluice box had been moved about 15 feet from its original position, and my shovels and picks were arranged in a weird pattern, almost like someone had been examining them. My first thought was that some locals or hikers had stumbled across my site and messed with my gear. It made me angry, but there wasn't any damage, just things moved around. I set everything back up and got to work, though I couldn't shake this uneasy feeling all day. That evening, I decided to set up my trail camera, one of those motion-activated ones I usually use to monitor wildlife activity around my claims. I mounted it on a tree overlooking my main work area and equipment. The next morning, same thing. Tools rearranged, But this time my gold pan was placed perfectly centered on top of my tool chest, which was weird because I distinctly remembered leaving it by the creek. I immediately checked the trail camera, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The timestamps showed activity around 2:30 a.m., and there was this figure in the frames. I've lived in Colorado all my life. I know what bears look like on trail cams. This wasn't a bear. The images showed a massive humanoid form, easily 8 feet tall, examining my equipment. The creature's fur appeared dark, almost black in the infrared lighting, but what struck me most was how deliberately it moved. In one sequence of photos, you can see it picking up my rock hammer, turning it over in what I can only describe as massive hands, before carefully placing it back down. This wasn't some animal randomly disturbing things. This being was studying my tools with obvious intelligence. The rational part of my brain tried to explain it away. Maybe it was someone in a suit, a prank. But who would trek 4 miles into the mountains in the middle of the night just to rearrange a miner's tools? And the size of it? No human could pull off that kind of costume and move so naturally. Over the next few days, the visits continued. Each morning I'd find my equipment rearranged in different ways. Sometimes tools would be grouped by size, other times by type. Once, all my digging tools were arranged in a perfect circle. The trail cam kept capturing images, and each night's photos showed the same figure, always between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. The creature seemed particularly fascinated by my metal detector, often holding it up to what appeared to be its face, though it never turned it on. What really got to me was the smell. About a week into these visits, I started noticing this powerful, musky odor around my site in the mornings. It was unlike anything I'd encountered before, not the rotting smell of a carcass or the sharp scent of a bear, but something else entirely, almost like wet dog mixed with something earthy and ancient. The smell would be strongest around the areas where my tools had been handled. On October 1st, things escalated. I had been staying up later than usual, working by lantern light to process some promising material I'd found. Around 10 p.m., I started hearing wood knocks in the forest around me, clear, deliberate sounds like someone hitting trees with a solid object. They seemed to be coming from different directions, almost like a pattern. Then the rocks started, small ones at first, landing several yards from my position, not thrown directly at me, more like trying to get my attention. I was terrified but also intensely curious. Against every survival instinct, I stayed put, my hand on the bear spray on my belt. That's when I heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush. Whatever it was huge, breaking branches that would have taken significant force to snap. The steps circled my position, staying just outside the range of my lantern light. Then I saw it. Just at the edge of the darkness, a massive silhouette. The creature had to be at least 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a pronounced brow ridge that caught the dim light. Its eyes reflected my lantern's glow with an intelligent, almost reddish gleam. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. There was this overwhelming sense of being in the presence of something ancient and intelligent. Then, slowly and deliberately, it reached down and picked up a rock from the ground. I thought this was it. I was about to die. But instead it placed the rock carefully on top of a stump about 20 feet from me, turned, and walked back into the forest. The movement was fluid, nothing like the awkward gait you'd expect from a person in a costume. The sound of its footsteps gradually faded into the distance. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the stump, I found the rock placed precisely in its center. Next to it was one of the quartz samples I'd collected earlier that day, one I knew contained visible gold flakes. I had left this sample in my collection bucket, which meant the creature had gone through my materials, identified the most valuable piece, and deliberately placed it there. I packed up my site the next day, left the claim despite its potential. Some things are more important than gold. I've got all the trail cam photos saved on multiple hard drives, but I haven't shared them. I know what people would say, that they're fake, that it was all an elaborate hoax. But I know what I saw. I know what I experienced. The thing that keeps me up at night isn't fear. It's the realization that these creatures, whatever they are, aren't just simple animals. They're curious, intelligent, and far more aware than we give them credit for. Sometimes I wonder if it was studying me as much as I was studying it, learning about humans through our tools and technology. I still mine, but I've moved my operations to more populated areas. Yet every time I'm setting up my equipment, I can't help but wonder if somewhere, in the deep forests of Colorado, that creature is still out there, wondering about the strange tools humans use to dig up shiny rocks from the earth. I haven't been back to that claim since, but I've heard from other miners in the Nederland area about their tools being mysteriously rearranged at night. I don't tell them what I saw. Some things you have to experience to believe.